for the whole world. On this occasion, I convey you the keenness of the Saudi leadership in eradicating this inhuman practice. Thank you.
For today, titled Victims, Not Soldiers. So without further ado, I will be handing it over to Juliet Foster, who will be moderating the session. Juliet, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for that, Al Jawara. I would also like to welcome our virtual audience to this special discussion, Child Soldiers Victims, or Child Soldiers Victims, Not Soldiers. Now, I think it's fair to say that this is a deliberately thought-provoking title, and it's one that deserves to be considered against a statistical backdrop. These are the statistics, because globally around 250,000 to 300,000 children are fighting as soldiers in conflict zones around the world. 4 out of 10 of these youngsters are girls. Children, some as young as 8, are not only used as combatants, but they're also used as cooks, spies, messengers, sex workers, and in the most extreme cases as suicide bombers. Which leads to the question, what becomes of those youngsters who manage to survive exposure to such extreme, sustained levels of violence? Can they be successfully reintegrated into society? And more to the point, what can be done to make sure that other vulnerable children avoid going down a similar dangerous path? Well, those questions are more pertinent than ever because they're coming at a time when a global conflict itself is on the rise. And of course, as countries battle to control a pandemic that has already claimed the lives of more than 2 million people. Now, the world and indeed international news cycles are, of course, distracted by COVID-19 for obvious and understandable reasons. But please do not forget that whilst we put the focus on the virus, the suffering of these children goes on. Now, I'm delighted to welcome an expert panel who, over the next 60 or so minutes, will explain how these youngsters are recruited into these conflicts and what the international community can do to raise awareness of an issue that is one of the major threats to childhood. And I would urge you to listen to what our panel has to say, because they are on the front line and they're going to bring you the challenges which they face every day as they try to help some of the world's most vulnerable youngsters. So let me begin first with His Excellency Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabia, who of course read the opening remarks. He is the Supervisor General of the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Centre. So thank you so much for being with us, Excellency. Also, I would like to welcome Filippo Grandi, who is the UN High Commissioner to UNHCR, that is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Welcome. His Excellency Dr. Abdul Majid bin Abdullah Al Bunyan, who is from the Naif Arab University for Security Sciences. Welcome. Her Excellency Dr. Diana Keita, who's the Deputy Executive Director for Programs of the United Nations Population Fund. And a welcome too to Sharon Riggle. Sharon is the Chief of Office for the UN Secretary General's Representative for Children and Armed Conflict. Can I say as well that we know you are all very busy, so we appreciate the fact that you have agreed to make the time for us. Now, a couple of things before we get into the discussion. Firstly, one of our guests, Dr. Keita, can't be with us for the duration of this event, but although I know that we have to let go of you at the top of the hour, we'll make sure that you get as much airtime as possible, because I know there is much that you want to share with us. So what I'd now like to do is to introduce a video message which comes from Virginia Gummer. She's the UN Representative for Children and Armed Conflict. Let's hear what she has to say in this special message recorded for us.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen.
Distinguished guests,
a few days
ladies
ago,
and gentlemen.
on February the 20th,
a few days ago,
the world
on February the 20th,
International Day against
the world marked the International Day against the use of child soldiers. This day was established in 2002 when the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict, known as OPAC,
Ever since
came
20th
into force.
February remains a key
Ever since 20th
opportunity for us
February
all
remains a key
to advocate
opportunity
against
for us
child
all
recruitment and
to
use,
advocate
but
against
also
child recruitment
to
and
commit
use,
and
but
act
also
to protect
to
these
commit
boys
and
girls.
act to
I
protect these
thank
boys
the
and
King
girls.
Salman Humanitarian
I
Aid and
thank
Relief
the King
Center
Salman
for
Humanitarian
letting me
Aid and Relief
address you
Center
today.
for letting me
The mandate of the
address you
Special
today.
Representative of the
The
Secretary
mandate of
General
the
for
Special
Children and
Representative
Armed
of the
Conflict
Secretary
was
General
established
for
in
Children and
1996.
Armed Conflict was
Following
established
the
in
publication of the
1996.
Grassa Marshall
Following the
report,
publication of the Grassa
identified
Marshall
children
report,
as a primary
which
victims of
identified
conflict.
children as a
The
primary
mandate
victims
has
of
evolved
conflict.
over the past
The
quarter of a
mandate has
century,
evolved over the past quarter of a
but it has
century.
been and remains guided by four
But it has
core
been and
pillars:
remains guided by
protecting
four
children
core
used and
pillars:
abused
protecting
in,
children
by,
used and
for
abused
armed
in,
conflict,
by, and
preventing
for armed
violations from
conflict,
occurring in the first
preventing
place,
violations
including
from occurring
by
in the first
engaging with
place,
parties to
including
conflict,
by engaging
raising
with parties
awareness
to
about the
conflict,
plight of those
raising
children,
awareness
and
about the plight
strengthening
of those
partnerships,
children,
promoting
and
lessons
strengthening
learned and
partnerships,
best practices.
promoting lessons learned and
Since
best
its
practices.
establishment 25 years ago,
Since its
the
establishment
Children and Armed
25
Conflict
years
Mandate
ago, the
has
Children and Armed
mobilized the
Conflict
international
Mandate
community
has
to
mobilized the
recognize
international
the children
community to
associated with
recognize
parties to
that
conflict
children
should be
associated with
considered
parties to
primarily
conflict
as
should be
victims,
considered
as
primarily
emphasized
as
in the
victims,
title of this
as
event.
emphasized in the
Let me
title of
highlight
this
a few
event.
additional achievements
Let me highlight
for
a few
conflict-affected
additional
children
achievements
since the creation
for
of this
conflict-affected
mandate.
children since the
The
creation
international
of this
community
mandate.
has identified
The international
six of the
community
worst
has
violations
identified
against boys
six
and
of the
girls,
worst
namely
violations
the
against boys
recruitment
and
and use
girls,
of children,
namely the
killing and
recruitment
maiming,
and use of
rape and
children,
other forms
killing
of
and
sexual
maiming,
violence,
rape and other
abductions,
forms of sexual
attacks on
violence,
schools and hospitals,
abductions,
and the
attacks
denial
on
of
schools and
humanitarian
hospitals,
access.
and the denial of
OPAC, the
humanitarian
optional
access.
protocol to the Convention on the
OPAC,
Rights of
the
the
optional
Child
protocol to
on
the Convention on the Rights of the
Children and
Child
Conflict
on the
has been
involvement of children
ratified
in
by
armed conflict
170
has been
countries.
ratified by
Our engagement
170
with parties to
countries.
conflict has
Our
led
engagement
to
with
several
parties to
hundreds of
conflict has led
commitments by
to
governments
several
and
hundreds
parties
of
to
commitments
conflict
by
to
governments
better
and
protect
parties to
children from grave
conflict, to
violations
better
such
protect
as
children
in
from
the
grave
issuance of
violations
command
such
orders,
as in the issuance of command orders, the signature of
the
roadmaps
adoption
or
of measures
updated
put in
work
place
plans,
during
the
military
adoption of
operations,
measures
or
put
the
in place
signature
during
of
military
joint
operations,
action plans.
or the signature of joint
Engagement
action
with
plans.
parties to conflict has also
Engagement with
enabled
parties
the
to
release of more than
conflict has also enabled the release of
160,000
more
children
than
from armed forces
160,000 children from
since
armed
the
forces
beginning of
and
this
armed groups
mandate.
since the
Despite
beginning
all
of
the
this
progress
mandate.
children survivors
Despite
as well
all
as
the
their
progress
communities
children
do not
survivors
always
as well
have
as their
access
communities
to the
do not
long-term
always
and
have
sustainable
access
integration
to the
support
long-term
they
and
deeply
sustainable
need and
integration
deserve.
support they
This
deeply need
includes
and
access to
deserve.
education, health,
This
and
includes
psychosocial
access to
support,
education, health, and psychosocial support, as well as training and livelihood opportunities. 3 briefing papers with relevant recommendations on possible ways forward were recently published by the Global Coalition for Integration of Child Soldiers, which is co-chaired by my office and by UNICEF, and of which the King Salman Relief Center is a member of its founding advisory committee. The studies confirmed an urgent need for well-funded and sustainable integration programs for these child victims and explored new possible actions and global funding frameworks. They also highlight the importance of extensive cooperation within the international community to support long-term and sustainable integration efforts. The reintegration of children released from armed forces and groups is absolutely crucial to ensure a future in which children can be children. But another key component is the inclusion of child protection issues into peace processes and peace agreements. A year ago, my office launched the practical guidance for mediators to protect children in situations of armed conflict, elaborated in collaboration with our United Nations partners. By identifying best practices for the integration of child protection issues into these processes, the guidance document aims to support prevention and mediation efforts by the United Nations as well as regional, sub-regional, national and local actors. Ladies and gentlemen, the current pandemic context is posing additional challenges to our efforts to protect children living in conflict contexts. It restricts access to programs, complicates the delivery of services, disrupts education, and hampers dialogue with parties to conflict. The pandemic also highlights the importance of a strong international cooperation, a cooperation that involves all partners working for the protection of children affected by armed conflict and with all of their capacities. This includes member states, but also civil society organizations, academia, and the private sector. We have a joint responsibility to protect children from hostilities so they can become positive agents for change in the future. And this starts by working together to build a more peaceful present now. Reintegration efforts have never been so important. I congratulate you on this initiative. Thank you for holding this event. I hope you have very fruitful discussions.
That was Virginia Gamba, the UN representative for children and armed conflict. Dr. Arabia, can I start with you first? Many messages came out of that as the platform, the Children's Armed Conflict Mandate. The point that she was getting at is that child exploitation is increasing. There are many manifestations of this in the military sphere, drug trafficking, etc. But what does this actually tell us about the status of children in today's world if they are used in this manner? And I'd like to know how your work at King Salman Relief actually tackles this, because this is an issue which is very important to the Saudi authorities and one which they are really keen to tackle head on.
Well, thank you, Juliet, and let me again, like you, welcome my colleagues, panelists, and I appreciate their time and their presence with us in this very important subject. As stated, I think recruitment of children nowadays is becoming a big challenge for the international community. It's a phenomenon that has affected children not only in conflict zones, but even beyond conflict zones. And as you rightly mentioned, it goes beyond child soldiers. I think it's going to include drug trafficking, sexual work, and also political use and money laundering and beyond. Now, this issue cannot be handled by one body or one organization. It is actually a duty of the whole international community, including the UN and its agencies. And we value the office of Ms. Virginia Gamba and her valuable team, and other also very important related organizations such as UNICEF. KS Relief from the inception of the center 5 years ago, has invested a lot to protect children. The center, as we know, has probably been present in 59 countries, and most of our projects has been directed to the protection of children. We have conducted over 294 projects in more than 16 countries for safeguard children, reaching more than 118 million child globally. In Yemen, we have found the issue of using children as actually children associated with armed groups is a big issue, it's a big challenge, and that's why we have started studying this dangerous problem in Yemen, and getting some lessons from it, communicating with our partners, and then we have started to have a program directed to prevent this program. The challenge is we cannot wait till the conflict is over, so the center decided to start during the conflict, and with the help of very important and expert partners, we managed to start this program in many regions of Yemen, and we hope that we have managed to develop lessons that we will discuss later in this panel. And we also started to engage with the UN, and especially with the office of Miss Virginia Gamba. And as have been mentioned, we have been also part of the global coalition for reintegration of child soldiers. And we hope that with the help of the UN, with the help of our other very important and engaged partners like our panelists, we will be able together to come out with many sustainable solutions that will bring this dangerous phenomenon to an end in the near future. Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you very much. I would like to follow through something that you said within that statement, and also to get the reaction of our other panelists, because you said as well that you're not just working with children who are taken out of conflict zones, but you're actually working with them whilst they're in there. Now, you guys are the experts, I'm not, but it does strike me as a rather groundbreaking approach, because it seems to flip things on its head. I mean, is it groundbreaking? And I'd like to get the response of other panelists, but Dr. Abdullah, if you can actually explain that, and then we can have the reaction of the other panelists too, that would be very helpful.
Well, Juliet, I think the challenge is when you are dealing with the conflict, and I must admit it's not easy, and that's why we have to be in touch with the international partners, and more important, with local NGOs, and we appreciate the work of all of them. And this is at the beginning we have to look why those children actually have been recruited. So the first step is that we have to prevent it during the conflict. And we have noticed, Juliet and colleagues, that economy is one issue, and probably drugs, especially in Yemen, GAT is another issue. Those issues, whether for the sake of food, for the sake of getting GAT, which is a narcotic, or other essential needs, those children have been recruited. So our first step is to prevent it from happening by reaching to those families, trying to provide them with essential needs, and also moving them from dangerous areas to probably certain better and safer places, and providing them and their children with either money or food or shelter and education for their children. Secondly, I think, how can we use local NGOs to recruit children and get them from being used as child soldiers, and distracting them from their recruiters? And this is the other way. And the third way is to bring about programs, believe it or not, in very critical areas such as Ma'rib, such as near Aden, near Taiz, to have a modified school for reintegration, which incorporates educational, psychological, family, social programs to take them away from the environment. All of those efforts is happening during the conflict, Juliet. And this is a lesson learning. I must admit we are learning as we go and we are developing as we go. And with the help of valuable teams such as the panelists today, I think we can do a better ways and better outcome to solve such problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me get the response of our other panelists to this, because it is a holistic approach, but it is happening during the conflict itself. Does that mark a step change from how this issue was approached in the past? Dame Pietro, if you could respond to that, and then followed by Filippo and Sharon, please.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Greetings, Juliet, and Honorable Dr. Abdul Al-Rabia, High Commissioner Philip Grandi, Honorable Abdul Majid bin Abdullah, dear panelists. I'm very, very privileged to be here. And it was a great question asked to Dr. Al-Rabia, I think, because I think he really spot on. It is important, as we are talking about child soldier now, to be working right there where the conflict is happening. It is happening, they are there. Some of us work in the humanitarian settings, so we need to assist while doing that. And you mentioned something, Juliet, is the proportion of girls who are recruited as child soldiers. And working from an agency like UNFPA, for us, it's very, very important to ensure that we take care of them in the conflict situation itself. Because as they may be fighters, suicide bomber, wives, cooks, sex slave, porter, guards, whatever, it is important that we give them a sense of existence. It's not even the sense of belonging, because they have lost that part in their lives. So that's why what Dr. Abdullah said, is it important for us to be on site? And personally, I have been on site in those conflicts where child soldiers are in my previous career. And it is important that they know we are there for them. For the protection first. First is the protection side. And during the protection side is the education linked to that. Education linked, because you need to give them a sense of living again, especially those girls. So that's why really I'm very proud to be part of the UNFPA team, because that's where health is important. The reproductive health is important. Let me take just one example. Those girls used as sex slave or wife even, they have no idea what their body is about. They have no idea what is the respect into that can construct their future life. So this is why we need to be there in the middle of the conflict to work with them to try to save them. There is another key word that Dr. Abdullah mentioned. It was the family education. You know, whether inside or outside the conflict, this all happened because of insecurity, because of lack of peace, but mainly because of poverty as well. Poverty is really the main issue for that. So while we raise awareness around the child soldiers, we need to do the same thing with the family at the very, very same time. And so that's why partnership is important. That's why it's so important to know that KS Relief works in so many countries, including in other parts of the Arab region. And this is why the partnership from us, UNFPA, on our specific mandate, gender-based violence, that can reach out to boys and girls, and to other partners, I think it's important that we are there on the middle, so that when we can come out with them, when we can save some of them, then we continue the education. And education is really beyond the classical education. It's really education to life, education to how to take care of yourself and to reintegrate your society. Maybe for the time being, I stop there. And
right. Thank you so much. Because I want to bring in Felipe Grande, followed by Sharon, because the key thing is it's an incredible approach. It is holistic, but it is happening whilst the conflict itself is occurring. And does that represent a step change in approach? Filippo?
Yes, I think so. Thanks, Juliet. Let me also join others in thanking the King Salman Center and Dr. Rabia in particular for this initiative of convening this discussion. There is the 12th of February coincidence, but of course this is very urgent and topical, so thank you for that. Now, you may wonder why I'm here. I'm the High Commissioner for Refugees, and others in the UN system, as mentioned by Dr. Rabia, the Office of Virginia Gamba, UNFPA, UNICEF in particular, have a more comprehensive mandate over these issues. But the lens through which we at UNHCR look at this is an important lens nevertheless, and it goes to your question, Juliet, because there is a very close link between conflict and the type of conflict in which these horrible abuses happen, including forced recruitment of children and the forced displacement of people, including children, with which my organization deals with. Remember, there's 80 million displaced refugees in the world. Half are children. Half of them are children. And they are very exposed because of their situation. They're very exposed to all sorts of abuse, economic abuse, sexual abuse, and they're exposed also to recruitment, which is one of the worst forms of abuses. And in many situations, think of Yemen, that was mentioned by Dr. Rabia, think of Syria, think of Northeast Nigeria. I can mention many other places. We and other humanitarians are present in situations of displacement where forcibly recruited children are also present. They are part of the population that we serve, that we work with, but they have this particular vulnerability and situation. I just want to flag another couple of points just for the sake of the discussion. It is also interesting that we observe situations in Somalia, for example, where I'm mixing armed groups now, where Al-Shabaab is telling village leaders to bring their children to fight with them. Or in Niger, for example, where also armed groups are forcing communities to give up their children, boys and girls, to serve their armed effort. Now, these situations are causing displacement by themselves because people afraid of that forced recruitment of their children go away and move to safer areas. So it's really another link. I just want to conclude by saying this. Yes, we are present. Two things to be flagged, and then more maybe later, but two things to be flagged. One, these are sensitive situations. It's always sensitive to work in a situation of conflict, as many of us do, but to reach out to people that may be actively being recruited at that particular moment is highly sensitive. You can well imagine that. So we need to develop. We have workforce that is trained to deal with that, even in dealing with children. Counseling and interaction with these children has to be sensitive of the extremely dangerous situation they're in. Second point I wanted to make, speaking also to a broader audience, we need resources to do that. You know that in average, humanitarian operations are funded just below 70% of their actual global needs. Child protection activities, under which heading comes all that we do for this phenomenon of child soldiers, are funded well below 50%. We have situations in which child protection activities are funded at 5% of their needs. So if we don't move the needle in the resources that frontline agencies, and as Dr. Rabia said, many times these are local providers, local NGOs. If we don't move the needle on resources, we won't be able to be effective in situations in which, unfortunately, operating is expensive because of insecurity.
Yeah, can I follow through on that point, in fact, with you, Sharon? Because what does it say about us as an international community if we are not prepared to invest in these resources? Because as the panel has outlined, there really is an urgent need. I don't wish to over-dramatize things, but we're talking about saving a generation of children. They are our tomorrow. How can they be part of this future if we're not prepared to put in the money to help with those resources?
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to this very important event. I think that I agree with what the panelists have said so far, and resources are definitely an important part of that. I think there's also a problem with the recognition that child protection is actually a priority. One of the issues that our office faces, and certainly we work closely with UNICEF, is the falling down the agenda of children. It's an easy thing to forget. They can't speak for themselves often. So I think it's a resource issue to a certain extent, always. It's also a political will issue. That we need to recognize that children, as we have done with gender and mainstreaming and been very successful with that, we need to do the same for children for the reason you just mentioned, that they are the next generation, they are the future. And if you allow to comment on a couple of the points that have come up so far, this is something that, of course, our office does every day. And to remind those who are listening, I'm working in the office of the SRSG for Children Armed Conflict. The video that we just saw, that's my boss. So I won't go into what our office does. But I think we also need to underline that children, we were talking about children being released in the middle of conflict. Well, this is something they have a right to always be released during conflict. This is something that will happen whether we plan for it or not. We try to encourage it. We try to advocate for that. It's something that happens anyway, and it is something that they have a right to, and they have a right to reintegration programming. And as His Excellency mentioned, KS Relief is also part of the Global Coalition for Reintegration that we co-chair with UNICEF, trying to close that gap of the recruitment and their release and coming through and making sure that they reintegrate properly, peacefully back into society. And I think, excuse me, we've published, last year we published 3 documents looking at different aspects of reintegration in terms of gaps and crossing the humanitarian development peace nexus and some financing innovation areas. And I encourage you to look at our website for that. But I think also we need to understand better the reasons children are going into these groups. Yes, it's economic, but it is also societal. And Mr. Grande was speaking of the push sometimes that families do, or the pull from the groups, or what the children themselves need to do. What we learned, and the UN University did an excellent study on this, and it's on, and there's more ongoing, but it was a document called Cradled by Conflict. And it looks at the reasons children join these groups. And it turns out that it is actually a constellation of factors. And I think if we're trying to really look at the prevention side of all of this, we need to look holistically at what the push factors as well as the pull factors are for these children to join groups. Sometimes it's economic, definitely. Sometimes it is what your family is doing. Sometimes it is, I don't have enough to eat. Sometimes it is a matter of status. We're dealing with young people, right? They are especially vulnerable to certain types of pull. So we need to look, if we're looking for solutions, we need to look holistically at the reasons they join, and very importantly, looking at the reintegration programming, which I know is one of the things we've discussed here today, but really have a deep dive into that, because this is not a phenomenon that will end in our lifetimes. This has been going on for millennia, probably, but the way it happens now, of course, is different. But we need to also be looking at how do we help them when they come out? And yes, it's resources. Sometimes it's political. Sometimes it's institutional. There are myriad challenges that we face. with that, which I won't go into in just a public discussion. I'll leave it there and again, appreciate this opportunity to discuss this topic. Thank you.
And that's fantastic. And thank you as well for that broad approach, the broad answer, in fact, to that question. But look, I would like to bring in Dr. Abdul Majid, because look, I want to talk about language, because as our panelists have said, look, these children, they have rights. Those rights need to be recognized. They need to be made a priority. And it is that title, isn't it? Child soldier. It's the connotations that go with it. It assumes that these children who are used in conflict situations, they are simply combatants, even though they have multiple roles. In terms of making child protection an issue, is it time for us to actually ditch that title, child soldier, and find something which is more encompassing in terms of what these kids are going through, that who knows may actually open up the gates towards some sort of wider compassion amongst those who can make a difference?
Thank you, Juliet. First of all, I'd like to thank the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center for the tremendous efforts in many parts of the world, and to His Excellency Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabi' for his kind invitation to participate with this distinguished panel. Juliet, this is a very interesting question. I think it's more to do with the image that comes to mind when we hear the term child soldier, rather than probably the term itself. When we think of child soldier, the typical image that comes to mind is a boy carrying a weapon. But the reality on the ground is different, actually. And as you rightly indicated earlier, that nearly half of those children are girls. In addition, unfortunately, significant percentage of child soldiers are used in wider variety of activities, some of which you have already alluded to earlier. I must say I'm not a legal expert, but the term has also legal implications, and therefore we will probably need to take this into consideration while thinking about the appropriate terminology.
Okay, and sorry, did anyone want to respond to that before I throw a question out to the panel? Would anyone like to answer that about the language? Is it time to change the language? Because in changing the language, the way that we refer to these children, it breaks down perceptions. Dr. Keita.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that's very important. We need to change the languages, because if we don't, then we are in trouble. I like what High Commissioner Filippo Grandi said, and what Sharon put an emphasis on. You know, maybe it has been there forever, but at least we are lucky. We are this generation who is changing things. That's, you know, our legacy, this generation. It's time to change language, and it's time to do more. And as we talk, and this plea is important for us, you know, we work in community and harmony within the international community. We all have a specific role to play. My role cannot be done as UNFPA without the role of UNHCR. They are the big cluster protection within with UNICEF, etc. We do the gender-based violence. So we need to change to protect those children. We need the media, the press to help us change that. And my personal plea, Juliet, as a mother, as a potential grandmother one day, please, we need to put the resources on the bodily autonomy if we want the girls of tomorrow to get a chance to recover something out of it. But we need to change the language. Thank you so much.
No, absolute pleasure. Filippo, I should say, sorry, I do apologize. Filippo.
That's the Spanish version. I think this is a great question on language. I have a couple of observations. One is that, leave aside what name you give to these people, but it is very important that the perception is not that they are culprits, that they are perpetrators, that they are on the side of those who fight and who commit violence. I say this again from the perspective of my organization. Very often we have to deal with people fleeing that include children that have been recruited or are fleeing from recruitment. And what we are really advocating strongly with states, for example, is if they cross the border, give them asylum. Don't push them back into danger and forced recruitment again. We tell them, ensure that the places where they take refuge, be they internally displaced or refugees, is the civilian characters of those settlements is preserved, because otherwise the risk of recruitment follows them, even if they flee. Make sure that they're not retaliated again, that they're not detained. We see that happening. Children accused of having been fighting, they are detained and not treated as civilian refugees, I can use this word. So all these things are important because they point to the key question here. They should not be portrayed as fighters, but as victims. Now, how you call them is another matter, because of course, child soldiers has a certain, conveys a certain strong message. So whatever alternative language we use has to keep that strong message. Otherwise, unfortunately, in this noisy world, it won't be heard as a message.
And Sharon, I know that you wanted to respond to that point about language, how we should refer to these children.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. This is an issue that we've discussed, of course, in our circles, in our office, and with other colleagues. And it's child soldiers is a word that in our practitioner circles we do try not to use because of its connotations. So we talk about children who are associated with armed forces or armed groups, and because this can also soldier connotates a perpetrator, but also somebody carrying a gun, where the children, as has been already discussed, can be victimized in a number of ways. They can be porters or cooks or sex slaves or fighters or sentries, or all of these things are unacceptable, whether it's a government force that is recruiting them or accepting them to be recruited, or whether it's an armed group. Either way, these are children. They're under 18. We need to invoke the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I wanted to mention that too. My boss mentioned OPAC, the special optional protocol for that. And we just so we have to look at them as under 18, which again, culturally in some places is difficult to achieve, because they're, the age of majority is different in different places. But we do need to move away from the idea that these are child perpetrators. These are victims. These are children that we failed to protect first and foremost. These are children that are engaged in activities, even the worst activities, because society let them slip through the cracks, and we haven't protected them. We haven't given them other options. So definitely language is important in this. And I just wanted to say I would encourage us all to use the terminology that we use in our office and in our circles of, children associated with armed forces and armed groups. Kafag, we say.
Okay, we'll try to remember that. But look, a really important point raised, but I want to pick up on something that Filippo Grandi made, and I want to put that, in fact, to you, Dr. Abdulmajid, and also to bring in Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabi'a for his reaction, because Filippo talked there about giving children asylum, which moves into the bigger question about these young people involved in military actions. Should they be given amnesties? Because that in itself is a recognition of the complexity of what they have suffered. And on a much bigger point, are governments perhaps unwilling or just generally reluctant to go down that route because of the political risks that may be involved?
Yes, Juliet, I think the focus and priority should always be on prosecuting those who committed the crime of recruiting children in the first place. As many of our co-panelists here mentioned, I think we should always stress the fact that children are victims, while also taking into consideration the justice for victims and society at large, and also at the same time, amnesty shouldn't be exploited by recruiters to encourage the use of children to commit atrocities. I think international standards for fair trial for persons under 18 are vitally important. These standards place the best interests of the child as a priority, recognize the special needs and vulnerabilities of children, and place an emphasis on rehabilitation and the reintegration of the child into society rather than punishment.
So basically, we have to stand back from those fears. Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabi'a, what's your response to that, to this question about giving these youngsters amnesties and the reluctance on the part of some governments?
Well, thank you, Juliet. First of all, I enjoyed all the comments and important points that has been brought by all of the panelists. With regard to the amnesty, I think the issue is much bigger than just amnesty. I think amnesty is going to solve only a small part of the issue when it happens. But as Dr. Abdul Majid mentioned, I think there will be recruiters who will use that as a way out for many other reasons that is, I'm sure all of you know them. I think the best way is to investment on the prevention, whether, and you mentioned in the previous point, the changing the language. I think the changing the language is also the beginning of many issues. I am with the change of the language. I like the word that is children associated with the armed groups, but I will go even beyond that. I will go child inappropriate recruitment, because it's beyond arms and beyond soldiers. So we should look at a wider issue. Even outside the scope of a language, we should even change our perception of the issue. Culture, I think without culture change, and I discussed this with you, Juliet, before the panel, I think we have to change the culture, and changing the culture in certain countries, and you know that those children are heroes. So we have to go and work hard on the culture. And also we have to work hard on the legal system. Yes, we have laws, but is it time to revisit those laws, whether it is directed towards people, countries, or firms, or groups? So all of those issues, I think the valuable legal areas, especially the Global Coalition for Reintegration of Children and the Office of Virginia Gamba, I'm sure they are discussing them on a daily basis, but they have to be put on the table and discussed. I want also to mention that there are actually issues that are inherited in certain societies. We have also to look at them. I mentioned the word Juliet, virus. We are living in Corona now. By the way, COVID-19 probably has exaggerated the issue, and whether we protect one country without solving the global issue, that is not the solution. That is only putting on a band-aid on a huge bleeding vessel. It needs to look at it as a holistic issue, and I think it's time for us to have the people who are dealing with the problem, regulators, politicians, to sit in a bigger panel and look at those big issues to bring an end to this issue. I know it will take time. I agree with Sharon. It may not be finished today or tomorrow. And I agree with also Filippo, my friend, that the issue is not only in certain countries. Refugees are excellent recipe for the inappropriate use or recruitment of children. So I want to close by saying we should have probably a bigger and wider look at the issue from all angles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in fact, I want to follow that up because I want to go back to you, Dr. Abdul Majid. And again, I'd like the response of other members of the panel, because Sharon touched on this, the push-pull factor. In other words, there are many academics who say, look, the reason why these children get involved in these conflicts is because they're responding to what is happening around them, or perhaps they are manipulated, gaslit through patriotic speeches. If there's somebody who has actually joined a movement, they're seen as a hero, a martyr, they're eulogized, and that in turn encourages children to perhaps follow that path. Is it perhaps a bit dangerous because it's a very one-dimensional way of looking at things without taking some of the more complex issues underpinning it?
Yes, Juliet, I think if we are to prevent children fighting, we need to understand the conditions under which children become soldiers and work to improve these conditions. Push factors are circumstances, as Sharon has said, in a child's community that drives them to join an armed group. Circumstances such as poverty or the desire to seek vengeance. Whereas the pull factors are rewards or incentives that children know they will receive by joining an armed group, such as, they know they will get food or money. Even if not coerced, a child's decision to join is much less about a desire to do so and more about a choice between very limited options. I believe major factors such as the situation in which the child lives must be considered. Can we still speak of free will when a child suffers from hunger on a daily basis? And what about when they are denied an education and or watch their peers leave into other town to join violent military groups? So the situation is more complicated, and as many of the panelists have mentioned, we need to look at this holistically to be able to put effective protection measures, which is, I think, the best strategy.
An interesting point, and again, I'd like the response of the other panel members, because there are these incredible complexities, and yet there are some members of the international community who perhaps don't understand that, either because it hasn't been properly explained to them or perhaps willfully because it's politically useful not to understand. But that must be very frustrating for all of you on the ground, because you're trying to deal with something which is ultimately our responsibility. How does that feel when you know what is happening? You're trying to explain this to people and somehow they're not listening perhaps as thoroughly as they ought to. Can I get the response of Diana first and then move it to Filippo and then Sharon?
Thank you so much. This is such an important question. Probably I'll go where High Commissioner Filippo mentioned. This is a noisy word. It's a noisy word. There's so much noise. So we need to remain focused on what we do. And probably I would say something. It is important to focus on being on site when the violence is happening. But I think it's good in our awareness processes to brief as well on the prevention part and on the reintegration part. Having been at all the side of that issues, believe me, when you take back some of the child soldiers, women, you put them in a center like the kind of the King Salman wants, and give them mental support in education, self-confidence, and a mean to live, that as well practical example to the rest of the world to what need to be done. And something that has been mentioned by all panelists, the culture, sensitivity to the culture is so important. We women, we feel always guilty. Imagine that young girls, victim, vulnerable. So I think education, integration, and example of good practices of King Salman Center does everywhere in partnership with us, I think would be a good thing to do, to try to change that noise. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, because also we are about 4 minutes away from the top of the hour, so I know that we're going to lose you, but thank you so much for being with for being with us, I should say, and also for the excellent contribution that you have made in our time together. Thank you so much. Stay safe and good luck at that meeting. And Felipe, following on from the remarks that you heard a few moments ago, and then we can go to Sharon.
Yeah, remarks with which I fully agree, of course. I just wanted to go back to your specific question, Juliet. It is true that in the context of which we're talking about, very often the humanitarian actors, NGOs, some of us in the UN, are the only caregivers. There's nothing else, because these are very difficult areas, difficult to reach. So it is very clear that for groups such as, how is it now, children associated, anyway, that acronym that I cannot...
Children associated with conflict.
With conflict. I think we need to, sorry, Office of the Special Representative, we need to find a more easy name that everybody can grasp, not a UN language. Anyway, if in those situations, dealing with them cannot simply be done with the traditional humanitarian tools. This is very clear. I mean, of course, medicine, food, shelter, these things are very important. But this population, this community, this group of people needs very specific issues. It is very good, I think, and this was mentioned by others, it's very good that the awareness that education, for example, is not a second-tier need of humanitarian crisis, but is as important and vital, literally, as food and health. This is seeping in. I think that now we are all having that reflex. I was recently in a very sensitive situation in Sudan at the border with Ethiopia, visiting refugees fleeing from Tigray. There is a risk of having this type of phenomenon. And I was happy that the Norwegian Refugee Council, for example, already set up very simple schools for children. This is important. I go back to what Dr. Abdelmajid said. We need to give alternatives to these kids if we want to try to break that vicious cycle. We're up against very big forces and very big resources. But I think that we need, from the very start, when we get hold of them, when we get in touch with them, to provide them with alternatives. We need to develop, and this is also a discourse that is growing in the humanitarian community. The Dutch government, for example, is leading on that. We need to become better at mental health provision. These are traumatized children. Maybe they don't realize that they are, but they're traumatized children. So we need to become better at caring for that. May I add a point a little bit on the side, but again, going back to what Dr. Abdelmajid said, it's the perpetrators who should be held accountable. This we need, if there is a message that I hope will come out of this meeting, is that this needs to be done more seriously by the international community. I know that Virginia, UNICEF, UNFPA are all working on that. But is it possible, for example, that traffickers with impunity kidnap, literally, abduct children from places like Libya to have them fight in places like Syria, and nobody catches them in an era in which intelligence and information are so sophisticated? I can't believe it. I think there is not enough political will, in spite of all the Security Council resolutions and other resolutions. So holding perpetrators, not only directly, the war commanders, but also those that accompany and make this possible, like human traffickers, needs to be done more seriously. It is not done seriously so far.
Right, and that adds to the frustration. Sharon, your response, please.
Well, thank you. I share that passion that I see coming from Mr. Grande. I think it is absolutely vital that we hold the perpetrators accountable. This is something that our office tries to do in our ways. We have an annual report. For those that don't know our office, we have an annual report that the Secretary General issues to the Security Council, and this has a list of attached to it. So there are different ways in which we try to hold perpetrators accountable, and this includes engagement with actors, engagement with those who are on the list, or now we also, because of Security Council resolutions, we now also engage preemptively. So if it looks like things are starting to go in the wrong direction in a particular country, we can engage with that government, or we can engage at an earlier stage. And I do also want to highlight, and I'm really very glad this was brought up, but the mental health and psychosocial support aspect. And actually, I was involved with the Dutch government as they were trying to include this and language for this, and they got a lot of experts involved to bring it into the peace building frame too. So if we're looking at, again, one of the vital things is to bridge the divides between humanitarian development and peace. This is this nexus that we're talking about. It's our UN buzzwords at the moment, but it is real. There's the humanitarian bucket of money, because it comes down to resources, right? The humanitarian bucket of money, the development bucket of money, the prevention and peace building buckets. And there's hard to find continuity to bridge across those, especially when we're talking about children. And something that the Global Coalition recognized in the papers that we put together was that children need 3 to 5 years of support you know, in a lower fashion as time goes on, but still they need ongoing support. What they're getting now, and it's due to resource constraints, but also institutional and other constraints, they're getting a few months. And one of the things that we're trying to look at and doing some follow-on research and projects is to see how can we ensure that, you know, we grab them at that right moment, as was just said, and how do we provide support for them in their communities? Because of course, children don't exist by themselves. If we're talking about reintegration, if we're talking about push and pull factors, they exist in an entire community. And I think my colleague from from FPA brought up a good point too, that there's a lot of stigma involved. I mean, I think this is what you were alluding to. Child soldiers face stigma. Mental health issues is not even recognized in some countries as a real issue. So we've got that. And it's even stigmatized in the West. So we need to prioritize these are, and remembering that these are children. They're in a developmental stage. They still can be, you know, reintegrated successfully with the proper support.
And thank you very much. And I want to look at other children within this category, these vulnerable youngsters. We have touched on them. These are children in refugee camps. And Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabi, I want to bring you into the conversation on this because, look, we know that those who are doing the recruiting, some of them are very, very sophisticated, some of them are very crude, but I would imagine that a refugee camp offers up some very easy pickings for these people. So really, what can be done to keep these people out and at the same time empower the families of these children, where the children have families, that they can push back against the recruiters?
Thank you, Juliet. Let me just re-emphasize what Filippo mentioned about the refugee camps and IDP camps are ideal place for recruitment. Honestly, those families, those children lack resources, like money, like food, they lack education. So it will be the best place to recruit children for many other purposes beyond soldiers. And the best way actually to prevent this from happening, first of all, to minimize the causes of having refugees or IDPs. That's number one. Number two, we should probably revisit what we do for our refugees and IDPs. And I know Filippo and his teams are doing a great job, but I think it's not enough. He just already mentioned there aren't enough resources beyond basic things. So we need to invest a lot in not only just giving them food and maybe shelter. I think we should invest a lot in the education, in the culture, in the society, to engage them, to have their families also have some skills that they can work and do benefit to their society. It's also, if we have to work on the education, I hear the word mental health. I think refugee camps and IDP camps are ideal to change the culture. And there are cultural issues that Dr. Abdul Majid mentioned in certain societies. Well, we have to work very carefully and intellectually to change those misconceptions about the use of children. Those items will help us together to bring an end to having this phenomena, I would say, becomes a pandemic. We live now in a pandemic. Well, the use of children for many other inappropriate purposes is, to me, is at the moment is epidemic. It may become a pandemic if we don't pay attention to this malpractice by societies, countries, and also we did not do enough to help them. I want to close this statement by mentioning, and this is a word to my friend Sharon and also Ms. Gamba. When we started child rehabilitation or reintegration programs, and I looked at the literature myself and our teams and educational materials, whatever we say, there aren't enough. We have to communicate with the universities, educational programs, research programs, and I'm glad Dr. Abdul Majid with us. They are doing a lot in that regard. I think we should encourage research institutions for more applied research, because the solution needs a lot of study and assessment. Also, we have to have educational material for NGOs and organizations like us, how to deal with the problem, how to put a curriculum for reintegration, education, bringing them to the society so that they don't become a threatening weapons for the global society. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that. And what I want to do now is just to break away from the discussion for just one moment. We've crammed in so much in what is an absolutely huge subject, because what I want to do now is to introduce a second video, in fact. This is a presentation from Henrietta Fore, and she is the Executive Director of UNICEF, that is the United Nations Children's Charity. And listen to what she has to say, because it's a very passionate appeal, really, with a look to the future, a roadmap that perhaps many of us can reference. Henrietta Fore, thank you.
On behalf of everyone at UNICEF, on behalf of everyone at UNICEF, and good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Last week, the world marked Red Hand Day, the International Day to end the recruitment and use of children in conflict. It has been 25 years since the world received Graça Machel's groundbreaking report on the impact of conflict on children. The report was a call to action. 10 years after the report, the United Nations created the Monitoring and Reporting Mechanism on Grave Violations of Child Rights, a critical instrument to document the impact of conflict on children and to help shape solutions that can prevent these violations from happening in the first place. Since then, the mechanism has painted an unacceptable picture. Over the last 15 years, the mechanism has verified a shocking 250,000 grave violations against children in armed conflict. And this is just what the UN has been able to verify. The numbers are certainly higher. Thousands upon thousands of cases. Killing and maiming, rape and sexual violence, child abductions, attacks on schools and hospitals, denial of humanitarian access, and the recruitment and use of children by armed forces and groups. In response, UNICEF and our many partners are sparing no effort to serve, support, and protect these children. That includes reaching more children who have survived being recruited and used by armed forces and groups, and working with governments and non-state actors to reunite them with their families, reintegrate them into their communities, provide counseling and support to help them deal with the trauma, stigma, and shame and fear that they have endured, and to help their communities accept them for who they are, as children, first and foremost. But UNICEF is also calling for more. We want to prevent these violations from happening in the first place. We want to end child recruitment altogether. We call on our partners to help us strengthen monitoring systems, not only to document violations, but to assign responsibility for them. We call for stronger enforcement of laws and norms against harming children and better accountability. We call for more investment into child support and welfare systems at the community level. And above all, we call for the world to unite behind the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire as we address COVID-19, including calling on parties to conflict to allow the delivery of life-saving vaccines and to release all children from detention. Countries enduring conflict need to see that help, hope, and even peace are not only possible, they are essential, especially as countries resume the long task ahead of rebuilding the systems shattered by conflict and COVID-19. So today, UNICEF calls on the world to stand with us, to reimagine a world in which we can end grave violations like child recruitment and begin a new push towards a better, safer, and more peaceful future for children and their communities. Thank you.
That was a very powerful message there from Henrietta Fore. Now, we are coming to the end of our discussion, but before we part company, there are a few other things that I would like to do, because what she was talking about there was everybody working together. And you can't remove, if you like, the media from that process. And what I'd like to know from all of you is how you feel that you can make allies out of the media in terms of achieving the objectives that you want to fulfill for a very important issue. Child protection is massive. We cannot fail our kids. So how can the media help you in what you wish to do? Can I start first with Sharon and then to Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabi'a, and then we'll move it around the rest of the panel.
Well, thank you for that. And certainly the media, to be honest, I haven't given this a lot of thought until just now. I just think it's a very important question, because if we're looking, because it's ubiquitous now. In the furthest corners of every country, there are mobile phones, there's internet access. How can we better leverage this, especially with young people? I think there have been some NGOs that have been doing some groundbreaking work in really trying to use digital platforms to access young people with positive messaging, et cetera. But I think if we're looking at an all of society approach, we definitely have to bring in the media into all of this, and there's a sensitization that needs to go on. And I think one of the biggest hurdles, and there are champions in the media. There's some fantastic journalists and outlets that have done stories. But I think what we need to tackle is the stigma associated with all of this idea that children are perpetrators and not victims. This is something, especially if you're talking like in a terrorism context or something, it's very difficult for people to find the sympathy or the empathy to see these children as victims when they've perhaps committed acts of violence. So I think there's a sensitization and awareness that we need to do with communities and also with the children themselves. But I think this is something that our office, for example, one of the initiatives that we're taking up the recommendations that came out of those 3 papers that the Global Coalition put together, is to actually speak to some of the former child soldiers themselves. And we're in a COVID situation, so instead of bringing people together in person, we are going to be using digital platforms to try to bring them together. And I think that has a lot of inroads, a lot of opportunities, entry points, whatever, to bring media and to bring others into that discussion as well. So it's something I'll definitely do more thinking about, but we definitely need to be creative and be looking at a global, holistic approach to the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I put you on the spot like that with that question, but a great answer nonetheless. Thank you so much, Sharon. And Excellency, Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabi'a, how would you like to make allies out of the media so that they can actually pursue this story with energy?
Well, thank you. Let me start by what Sharon has mentioned. I think the magnitude of this problem is beyond our expectations. Whatever statistics we have, I think I would say it's low. So the only way to tackle this problem is to engage the media. And engaging the media as rightly mentioned by Sharon, is to engage all types of media, whether it is traditional media, whether it is social media, and we have to utilize the learned lessons from the past as an educational for the future. And I will go beyond the media, Sharon, if you allow, yes, Juliet, if you allow me. I think we are all responsible. This is a responsibility of everybody. We cannot just dump it on the media alone. We have also to be a messengers for the media. All of the NGOs, UN, political firms, universities, all of those are responsible. We cannot just tell the media, do it and solve the problem. We have to be an activist. We have to deliver the message and give them the recipe to deliver the message through the different types of the media. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Abdul Majid, engaging the attention of the public, getting the media on your side against this backdrop of a pandemic.
Thank you, Juliet. I think this is also a very important question, and I agree with what Dr. Abdullah has mentioned regarding the responsibility of all major players in the international community to ensure that they work together to address this phenomenon. And I also would like to, so I think engagement is very important. It's a key word here. If some of the media themselves, either, as also Dr. Abdullah mentioned, traditional or social media, could be involved in a way or another on the ground to see for themselves also what is happening. I think that would also clarify the message. But I would also like to allude to something that Mr. Filippo has mentioned before, is the importance of simple messages. Simple messages, I believe, is very important because they mobilize, they attract attention, they attract also funding. So it's also very important to focus on simple messages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Filippo Grandi.
I have 3 quick points. One is very parochial. It's about refugees but it is about perceptions and how media and the public discourse happens. We said, Dr. Rabia said very rightly that situations of displacement, refugees are fertile ground for this type of recruitment. Yes, absolutely. Let's just be careful that this doesn't become a stigma, which then expands to all refugees. I hear governments of countries producing refugees, I won't mention names, telling me, oh, those are not refugees. They're all fighters that go abroad just to come back and fight. So we have to be a bit careful there. And this is part of the public discourse. Second point, COVID. I think it was mentioned again by Dr. Rabi and others. I think that there is an opportunity. Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but you know what I mean. An opportunity there to explain. COVID has hit everybody. We're all impacted by that one way or the other. I think one of the messages that maybe we need to media need to help us amplify is that for certain groups in fragile countries, in countries in conflict, in refugee settings, COVID hits even harder from the social and economic point of view, depriving people of livelihoods because those livelihoods are very fragile. They go away. First livelihoods that go away in lockdowns. And therefore, young people that lose those livelihoods, they may be tempted more easily to be recruited and fight. And finally, a more direct message to the media. Yeah, help us by telling the world the real story. We heard today from people more expert than me in these matters. And Sharon explained it very well earlier, right? The motivation that push people to be child soldiers, the bad word, are so complex. We need to make the world understand that complexity so that they're more aware. Let's have a Netflix series on child soldiers where they speak and they tell their own story. Let's put together our energies. Maybe some of us in our audience are expert in producing this type of things. Maybe this exists already. I don't know. This is the type of of message that resonate. It's simple, it's real, and sometimes can be even told by the children themselves. That would be very powerful to create awareness.
Yeah, hearing the voices of the children. Now, I've just spotted Dr. Keita. Have you now returned from your meeting? If so, would you like to give us a quick response to the question about engaging the media before I hand over the floor to Dr. Al-Rabia?
Thank you so very much. No, I have not returned from my meeting, actually. I opened my meeting, but this is so at the heart of what we do. And this is such an opportunity and privilege, I cannot let it go. So just for that media question, I think I would like to go where Madam Arieta went from, denial of humanitarian aid, she said. I would say denial of dignity. Media can help us really focus on what government need to do. First, have the law in place, even though they are not implemented. Media can help us raise awareness. For that, we need to train them. We need to have them with us for them to understand where we are. But I think Dr. Majid said as well something very important. We need the scholars with us. We need the religious leaders with us, because the media only won't be, but all the partners, the international community and national community are to be involved in this. I couldn't go without saying this. Is the denial of dignity, and we need to give them back to the children. I thank you so very much. An honor to have been here. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that very powerful contribution. And this is very important because we talk about COVID-19 in the media, and it's obviously we are going through different phases of the story because now we've reached the point where we're talking about the vaccine rollout. But what has been said is that we cannot go back to the past. In other words, normal is going to change. And this is the point, that these children, they have to be part of that conversation to help establish that new normal. Otherwise, the phenomenon of using children in military conflicts, drug trafficking as sex slaves, this relic from the past will continue into the future and nobody benefits. Now, in terms of looking ahead to the future, I want to hand the floor to His Excellency Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabia, because there's a very important announcement that I know that you wish to make. Please do share.
Sorry, forgot the mic. Thank you, Juliet. Let me start before even mentioning the announcement that I am really proud and honored to be part of this panel. I enjoyed the discussion. I would like to thank Excellencies Dr. Abdul Majid, Filippo, Sharon, and Dr. Diani for valuable discussions and I would say passion that I have here today that has added value. This wouldn't have happened without a skilled moderator such as Juliet. All of this, I would even say this myself. I think the discussions and the resolutions, I'm sure there are teams who are dealing with it, but let me tell you how we look at the future by bringing an initiative that KS Relief or King Salman Humanitarian Aid Relief Center is willing to announce that we are willing to put for the near future the child soldiers, victims, not soldiers, a platform. This is going to be an interactive platform which we will share with our key partners, especially our partners in the UN and also the office of Ms. Virginia Gamba. And basically, this will be an interactive platform addressing this phenomenon of child recruitment in general, and also will be integrated with our partners to identify learned lessons and also solutions and outcomes that we can share it with the rest of the international community. I will stop here and I will thank you all, and hoping this platform will see the light very soon with your help and collaboration. And back to you, Juliet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And I'm sure that it will see the light, as you said. I'm sure there's going to be a very powerful response to that. Thank you so much for that announcement. Also, a big thank you to our virtual audience for getting involved. And of course, to the distinguished panel, speaking with such passion. And I'm with you all the way. That's all I can say. Thank you so much to His Excellency, Dr. Abdullah Al-Rabia. Filippo Grandi, I think I pronounced your name correctly this time, so apologies for the linguistic slip the first time round. His Excellency Dr. Abdul Majid bin Abdullah Al Bunyan, thank you so much. Her Excellency Dr. Diana Keita, and of course Sharon Riggle, thank you all so much. I am now going to retire from the scene, but before I do, can I also remind you as well that this discussion is not over. There is a second panel, which is really important, so please do attend. Children and Armed Conflict, look about it in a little bit more detail in a few moments, but I'm now going to hand the floor to Al Jahara. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Juliet, and I'd like to thank all distinguished panelists for such an insightful and eye-opening discussion that has really tapped into so much of the key topics that are at the core of the issue of child recruitment. I'd like to let you know that the first session has been over, and we would like to take a 10-minute break now, so we will be back with you shortly. Thank you so much. I think you're muted. If you could just unmute.
Thank you, Johara. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Hannah Omar, Director of Community Support Department at King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center. On behalf of my colleague at King Salman Relief Center, I would like to welcome you to the second session of this important event. This session is designed to have a more solution-based discussion and to know more about the best practices from different perspectives from our great experts. The recruitment of children and exploitation in armed conflict in all its forms are dangerous threats, not only to their current situation and community, but also to their development and their future, as well as the future of the peace process and its sustainability. Today's children are tomorrow's adults. And the consequences and continuity of this illegal and morally reprehensible practice will increase the potentials to have more violence and terrorism in the future. Today, we will discuss this important topic with great experts from different backgrounds in the next 2 hours. We have with us Mr. Cornelis Williams, Associate Director, Child Protection, UNICEF, New York Headquarters, Ms. Grain O'Hara, Director of International Protection in UNHCR, Dr. Hind Khalifa, member in the Saudi Human Rights Commission, Dr. Hijazi Ibrahim, Regional Program Specialist on Basic Education and Literacy in UNESCO, Dr. Muhammad Sahili, Director of Legal Affairs at the Islamic World Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, ISESCO, Dr. Shireen Al-Aufi, Advisor to Undersecretary of the Saudi Ministry of Education for General Education. Ms. Vanessa Murphy, Legal Advisor in the International Committee of the Red Cross, Geneva. Consular Abdullah Ruwaili, Secretary General of National Humanitarian Law and Consular at Saudi Red Crescent Authority. And Judge Hatim Ali, Regional Representative for GCC region in United Nations Office on Drug and Crime. Thank you all for being with us today. We will start with Mr. Williams. What is your point of view if some consider these children perpetrators and others would see them as victims? Also, we would like to know more about the UNICEF's role in assisting children who have exited armed forces or armed groups or who are captured by military actors during fighting.
Thank you very much, actually, for your question. You will hear more from others later on the legal framework for children associated with armed forces and armed groups. I was part of the first panel, and I did recall that Filippo Grandi had said we should find a better term for that. But for now, we will use the term. But I'd like to be clear that recruitment and use of children by armed actors is one of the most serious violations of a children's rights. And I can tell you the experience is devastating, and I have witnessed it personally in my career. Children who are captured or leave armed group must always be treated as victims. Their best interest must also be primary consideration. They have a right to the same protection, treatment, and services as any other child, irrespective of what they've done. We often see that national laws criminalize children sometimes for simple things when they're associated with these armed groups, like cooking, driving, or other roles that are performed for armed groups. This is conducted under normal circumstances, and we believe it should not be looked on as criminal. Now, you ask the question, perpetrator or victim. It is therefore wrong, no matter a child's age, for them to be detained or persecuted for it, right? But you raise an important point about child perpetrators. We know that sometimes children commit crimes while associated with armed forces or groups. A child can be both a victim and a perpetrator. Even in these cases, children would have a right to special protection. If the child has reached the minimum age of criminal responsibility, which is 14 under the Convention on the Rights of the Child have to have a right to child-specific due process based on their age, needs, vulnerability under international recognized juvenile justice and fair trial standards. When making a decision about the child's culpability, authorities should also consider the cohesive situation under which a child may have lived or have been forced to act. For us in UNICEF, we've been working for decades with children who've exited armed groups. And through conflict, change according to context, culture, and society, children are in so many ways the same around the world. They have an instinct to survive, to look for friends, for a place to belong. They want to be part of something bigger than themselves, like all of us do, and to contribute to their families and community. This is all part of the science of child development, which we should not forget. Based on the experience, we know that we must intervene early as possible with sustained support to build on the child's resilience to recovery from distress and experience of violence. As I said, it's based on child development science. We know that if we treat children and not as criminals and not as damaged goods, but as children, they can be successfully reintegrated and they could move on in their life course in terms of development. And we've seen successful developmental outcomes for most of these children that we have worked with. We have done it in conflict across the continent, from Sri Lanka to Thailand, to my country, I come from Sierra Leone, to West Africa, to East Africa, in the Arabian Peninsula. We've worked all over the world on this issue, in Latin America. And we know that actually we can release children who've lived under violent groups. And you ask us about a role. Let me quickly go through what a role is. First of all, we work with governments to establish a procedure to transfer the children who have been found by military personnel, justice, and all the law enforcement actors to child protection actors. In some situations, the children would walk up to us as child protection actors. To prepare for this situation, we make sure that the state armed forces have a handover protocol that defines a commitment and responsibility to protect children from the risk or harm after they're found. In other situations, we will have a formal demobilization and disarmament and reintegration process. In some contexts, actually, as we've said, the children would be transferred by the government directly, right? So the final point is, we also support actually parties to the conflict, irrespective of their political alignment, to develop action plans to end the grave violations. For example, we will help them train their personnel on child rights and child protection, put age assessment in place, and also actually we will support governments to strengthen their own system, their child welfare system, if it's not functional, or support NGOs to work with them so that they could provide immediate care for these children, interim care, preferable family-based, family tracing and reunification, mental health and psychosocial, and also services to address gender-based violence. Case management is also important. Finally, we believe that it's the community and the families that make a difference to the reintegration of those children. So we have to ensure that we identify safe and meaningful opportunities for community-based support and reconciliation and social cohesion. Thank you, Dr. Hannah.
Thank you for this great intervention. And now we're going to look at this issue from a more legal perspective. With us, Judge Ali. Under the statute of the International Criminal Court, conscripting or enlisting children into armed forces or group constitutes a war crime. On the other hand, we have the optional protocol on the Convention on the Right of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict. Besides that, we have more regional human rights instruments that have also evolved, such as the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of Children, and also the right of the child in Islam in organizations of Islamic cooperation, and many UN Security Council resolutions. What is the role of your office in the prevention of recruitment and development of children in armed conflict, and how to enforce these laws and hold these perpetrators who recruited these children accountable and to bring them to justice?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Dr. Hannah, for accepting me earlier than how scheduled. And please, I accept my gratitude and apologies to my more distinguished fellow panelists today. Allow me at the beginning to convey the gratitude of Dr. Ghada Wali, the Under-Secretary General, Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, for the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and for the initiative of King Sulaiman Relief Center to tackle this topic that actually falls in the core of the interests of UNODC and its allies of all the sister UN agencies and international organizations concerned for fighting terrorism and for the prevention of violence extremism. I totally agree with my colleague from UNICEF, and it may be known to you and part of the participants that UNODC and UNICEF, actually the High Commissioner Office on Human Rights and the UNHCR have formed a long-standing partnership to deal with the issues of children in conflict with law in general. And we have a global program that joined with the UNICEF that aims at exactly what you asked me at the beginning, how to extend the legal protection to children recruited and used in armed conflict and particularly in terrorist acts. Of course, it is a dilemma from not only from the humanitarian point of view, but from the legal point of view as well. And let me say that the geopolitical situation in the whole world, and particularly in Middle East and the Arab country, is not actually making the challenge any lesser than before, because it created a tsunami that was actually driven by the first wave of the global economic recession that have actually marginalized a lot of members of communities in a lot of countries, including in the Arab world, under the poverty and suffer, and made them much more vulnerable to falling as victims of crimes at large. For example, in our interest in UNODC, we look at children and women as vulnerable groups for illegal trafficking in human beings, for the exploitation and the use and deployment in armed conflict, but also all sorts of other exploitation, labor exploitation, sexual exploitation at large. And this wave was actually followed by another rather high wave of instability in the region and certain other regions in the world. Political and armed conflict has actually appeared in the Arab region that have caused another wave. And now it is followed by a rather higher wave, which is the wave of the pandemic COVID-19 that have actually made even larger numbers of societies to suffer. All this together formed a tsunami that put the children in the maximum vulnerability we have witnessed since the Second World War, and was reflected in the numbers we detected in our global report, a humongous increase in the number of children actually recruited and used for the armed conflict. Of course, we do understand, and I totally agree with my colleague in UNESCO and the other colleagues that are going to speak later, is that we can only look at them as victims, because the children, due to their vulnerability, due to their suffer, due to their lack of shelter, due to lack of stability and security, have actually been forced to fall under the patronage and the recruitment of the terrorist group, and have been exploited in the armed conflict. And this creates a legal status, even under the international criminal law that I gladly studied, but also under the international humanitarian law, under the international human rights frameworks, and under all conventions. We can only look at the children as actually victims of such a crime, exactly like how we look at the victims of human trafficking. Yes, they do commit some foul plays, they do participate to the criminal enterprise, but they are actually either physically forced to it, or they have been vulnerabilized to be used as such. So we cannot actually judge them for that. And for this reason and from this perspective, we have actually extended a lot of programs aiming at helping member states in extending the protection to children in vulnerable communities, especially the deportees and the migrants, being illegal migrants or legal migrants to other territories. The communities that live in recently liberated territories inside the countries, like in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, and so many other countries. We try as much as we could, of course, with the help of our also specialized colleagues from the High Commissioner Office on Human Rights and the High Commissioner Office on Refugees, and the colleagues from the IOM, the International, the UN International Office on Migration. We try to reach as much as we could from such vulnerable groups to try to play a preventive role. We try also to extend all the legal and health services needed to be provided to such vulnerable children groups together with our colleagues from the WHO. But on the other hand, we work through our global program on countering terrorism and violence extremism on actually building the capacities of the criminal justice and law enforcement in the different countries in the region to do exactly as you rightly highlighted, to be able to firmly, strongly, and sustainably held prosecutions and trials to hold the offenders of those crimes accountable. The terrorists who committed the terrorist crimes and who have actually recruited the children to commit terrorist acts. And for the countries that their domestic legal system have unfortunately not yet been able to see the children as victims, especially those are at the edges of the legal age, that we call them the juvenile, between 14 and 18 years. We work with the criminal justice system to try to provide a juvenile protection for those children and provide them access to legal aid and access to support during the trials, and to help the judiciary to focus on the fact that no matter the crimes they have committed and the gravity of those crimes, they've been instrumentalized by a more dangerous and serious criminal enterprise, which is the groups that actually use them as such. But to be honest with you, Dr. Hannah, and before I conclude, and that's why I'm very happy to be representing my organization in this very rich crowd of more specialized colleagues than mine, and to see this initiative coming from King Salman Relief Center. We actually need all the efforts because the challenge is much deeper than that. Now,
thank you, Judge Ali. Thank you. It's an honor to have you with us today. This will lead us to ask how your office can unify the collective effort and the different laws, like the national, regional, international laws, in order to counter the recruitment and use of children in armed conflict.
We are actually working on several initiatives on that. I mean, the task is very comprehensive and it is a complex, but what we are trying to do is to actually help driving a legislative reform initiative at the Arab countries, and we would wish that the King Salman would support this initiative to actually help the domestic laws in the Arab region, recognizing the status of the children fighters as actually victims of crimes. We are actually working also with a lot of our colleagues from different organizations on an initiative with the aim of taking a step backward to try to play a more effective preventive role, developing counter-narrative messages that actually try to dilute the messages of the terrorist groups. They use it in the recruitment. We are trying to make our partners realize that if we want to stop the use of children in conflict situation and in terrorist acts, we have to actually take an action not by combating terrorism, but combating violence terrorism, and try to work with the media and with the providers of the internet services and the mass communication tools such as Facebook, Messenger, Twitter, and so on. We have formed an ally with them to counter terrorism on their platform and to have a counter narrative to the recruitment of children and adults to terrorist groups through the partnerships with the service providers and with the international non-NGO department. We are also working very closely with our colleagues from UNICEF and from UNESCO on trying to reform the teaching methods and the teaching curriculums in the different countries to make the children actually more aware and more wise and make them immune to falling or to being victimized by the terrorist groups or being vulnerable to the counter narrative coming from the terrorist group. We're trying to work on all the solutions that we could put forward, but we remain open to any new suggestions. And as sorry as I am that I would have to leave earlier, I would be more than glad to continue communicating with your focal point and receive the recommendations of this decent seminar to see how we could work with you and work with the rest of our colleagues in the United Nations and the different organizations on improving our responses to protecting the children from falling or being used in conflict and terrorist acts. Thank you very much. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's really important to highlight all these initiatives, and that's why we are here to have this session, you know, to see the possible cooperation that we can have, you know, in order to address this issue properly. This will lead us to focus more on a specific group. Ms. O'Hara, what is the situation in refugee and internally displaced person camps in general? And are these children are safe and protected, or it's easy to exploit them, especially by armed groups?
Shukran, Hannah, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here today. As you know, our High Commissioner was on the preceding panel along with other of the UN invitees, and they got into very animated and informed discussion there. Your question goes to the specific work of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and I would frame our work in terms of forced displacement. Forced displacement is very often caused by conflict and situations of forced displacement, whether that produces refugees or internally displaced persons, will very often carry with it the risk of situations where children are at a particularly heightened vulnerability to the risk of recruitment. Now, it should be said, so as not to stigmatize refugee or internally displaced children as automatically being equated with conflict or worse still with terrorism, it should be said from the outset that the vast majority of refugees, the vast majority of internally displaced persons, they are in flight precisely from the type of uncontrolled conflict and terrorism, and they're more likely to be victims of that than they are to be perpetrators. But to answer your question directly, refugee and internally displaced persons camps, or even outside of camps where we see refugees and internally displaced people living on the margins of big cities, often in very marginalized and in impoverished situations, they are at a particularly heightened risk of falling prey to recruitment, and they can end up in the ranks of armed groups. You ask, are they sufficiently protected? And I think the honest answer to that, notwithstanding the efforts across the UN and by host governments, if they are hosting refugees, or home governments where we're talking about internally displaced persons, the honest answer to your question is no, they are not sufficiently protected. And these very vulnerable situations of camps, they can be a very high-risk location from which refugee or internally displaced children are recruited. And then we rely very much on the expertise of our colleagues from UNICEF. Cornelius gave a very eloquent explanation of UNICEF's work, and UNICEF is very much recognized amongst all the UN agencies as having that expertise on assisting with demobilization, rehabilitation and reintegration of children that are associated with armed groups, and we work alongside them in many operational settings where they provide that service to refugee and internally displaced children. Back to you, Hannah. Hannah, I believe you're...
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. What role does UNHCR play in demobilization and also reintegration of children associated with armed group or forces? In the first session, the commissioner mentioned community leaders. How can they facilitate or hinder this process?
Thank you, Hannah, for that follow-on question. I would, in large part, I defer to the expertise of our UNICEF colleagues who, as I've said, definitely have the expertise in demobilization. But of course, with specific populations, refugees and internally displaced persons, UNHCR has a number of responsibilities. Similar to what we heard from our colleague, Dr. Hatem, about prevention of recruitment in the first place, we in UNHCR have a very specific responsibility to ensure effective communication in refugee and internal displacement settings to ensure that this heightened vulnerability of refugees or internally displaced people in camps, particularly children, that they don't fall prey to recruitment. That depends a lot on, as your question was framed, on community leaders. We need to work very closely with the community leaders. We need to make sure that they are not passing messages of encouragement to children to join armed forces. Because again, if we reflect on the context of displacement in which all of UNHCR's work takes place, that there's generally speaking a conflict of some sort. And sometimes the very victims, survivors of that conflict manifested as refugees who have fled from a conflict situation, they can also be faced with scenarios where certain sectors of their community want them potentially to fight back. And in refugee and internally displaced camps, there may be that message coming from the community. So we have to work against those messages. We have to make sure that there are positive messages and that refugee children do not fall victim to being forcibly recruited.
Thank you so much. Dr. Khalifa, lately we witnessed many legal reforms in Saudi Arabia. Can you tell us more about child rights, especially child protection? And also we would like to know more about the measures taken by the kingdom to ban the recruitment of children in armed conflict.
Thank you, Dr. Hannah. I would like to start by thanking King Salman Relief Center for this invitation and for hosting this important event. To start by saying the crime of getting children involved in armed conflict is a humanitarian crime. It is a war crime. And as more and more conflict around the world, we see children are more involved in this armed conflict. And setting international and national laws are important to try to prevent children and protect children from getting into this armed conflict. In Saudi Arabia, The Kingdom has signed the Convention on the Right of the Child and also its optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict. The optional protocol is considered as to be as part of the domestic law. The state party also approved the optional protocol on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. And this was in August 2010. And as we know, both protocols are very much related and very much important in protecting children. And by acceding to this international agreement, they have become part of the Saudi national laws, as I mentioned, and their prevention carry the same legal authority as the laws forced in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The basic law of governance also indicate that the laws international treaties and agreements are to be issued by royal decrees, and the relevant authorities must, upon the entry into force of an agreement, take the necessary measures for implementation to ensure the fulfillment of all the Kingdom's obligation. On another level, on the national level, various measures has been taken, like the adoption of the Child Protection Act in 2014. The Article 8 in this Act contained the prohibition on the involvement of children below the age of 18 in armed conflict and their employment in activities that may harm their integrity or their physical or moral health. Also, it directs the competent authorities to take all possible measures to ensure that the persons under the age of 18 are not directly involved or indirectly involved in such armed conflict. Also, the establishment of a Child Rights Committee at the Commission of Human Rights, the establishment of Family Affairs Council, the establishment of a Child Protection Unit, which protects the rights of children affected by the armed conflict and meets their needs. Different departments are responsible for implementing the optional protocol. Different government bodies like Ministry of Interior, Defense, National Guard, Education, Culture and Information. Also, the Human Rights Commission has the task of following up and verifying that those bodies have taken the steps necessarily to implement the optional protocol. The Commission also responsible for uncovering any violation of this instrument, also ensuring liaison and coordination and to monitor implementation of international treaties. And they are working closely with other government bodies. I would like just quickly stop on the issue of protecting refugees, and as it was discussed in the first session, and now it was raised, the refugees are on high risk, especially children. Refugee, they are misplaced, and then they are the victim of many times the victims of armed conflict, and then they are on high risk to be recruited in on conflict, also in armed conflict. And Saudi Arabia, they are called visitors, also for the sake of segmentation. So they are called visitors, not refugee. And Saudi Arabia is considered one of the leading countries in hosting these visitors. The kingdom provides them with free health care, with education, and also keen to integrate them to the Saudi society, and also provide them job opportunities. The percentage of these visitors has reached 5.5% of the total Saudi population.
Thank you for this extensive overview. So, from human rights, we would like to narrow it down to talk more about education from a more global perspective to more national context. We'll start with Dr. Ibrahim. Education is an integral part of sustainable development. We are talking about achieving the 2030 Agenda, which is 9 years from now. Amid the pandemic, that exacerbated the situation everywhere, and especially in armed conflict. How we can achieve these goals, and what is the UNESCO role to ensure the future of education and child protection?
Okay, first let me thank King Salman Center, and thank you, Dr. Hannah, and thank you also Dr. Ruwailis. Before he was in the center, he introduced us to the center. And because of the center, we are running lots of projects. But let me just answer your question, which is more global. UNESCO is leading SDG 4, and SDG 4 now is not only focusing on education. SDG 4 is the tool to implement all the 17 goals for sustainable development. From poverty, from climate change, from health protection, all these, without going to these details. Without education, the world will never achieve these goals. Getting back to the context that we are talking about, and the role of education in protection for the children in difficult circumstances or under conflict. Education is life. Without education, children will really be exposed to all what we hear in the morning. Drugs, trafficking, crimes, terrorists. Education is the life-saving for these children. Being in a classroom, being in school itself, without even learning to heaven, it's a safe, it's a heaven for the children. So education also with learning, with good learning, it gives what we call resilient, makes the children resilient against all what we hear in the previous session and now in this session. Education will give the children with knowledge, with advocacy message against all what we hear, against violence, against crime, against drug. The education is really a safe haven for these children while they are engaged in learning. I can give example from our joint project actually in Lebanon for the Syrian refugees and in Yemen. And now we are having a project for 1,000 middle girls and boys, mostly are girls, very close to what we call informal camps in Lebanon for Syrian children. We can see the hope of the children. We can see the change of the children. They were out of school for 3 or 4 years. Now they are in school. See their writing. You are astonished when you see how they are expressing themselves in English, in French, and even in the technology side in computers. So education is really life, is really protection for the children who are really suffering any kind of bad circumstances and conflict. In Yemen, we are together. We are establishing a system in Yemen through 2 projects from King Salman that's really going to help millions of children to return back to schooling after their education, this are disrupted for 4 or 5 years. Even we are saying 7 years, they can get back to education. We are sitting with the Minister of Education, a system that really can get the children back to education again through what we call catch-up program or bridging program or second chance program. We are saving children at risk because we are talking not only education, but good quality education. We are giving also what we call remedial classrooms during the weekend, and Saturdays and Fridays and after school. And this content of education is not a classical one. If you give a classical one, they might drop out again. So we are giving education that really relevant, that really respond to the need of the children. Psychosocial here is very important to really, the way you teach, the teaching learning practice, how it can be different than the traditional one that sometimes let the children to be out. So I'll stop here and maybe I'll get other questions later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim. You mentioned one of the great projects with UNESCO, and we work together to jointly build and improve curriculum for out-of-school children. Thank you. Dr. Sahiwi, in ISISCO, what are the mechanisms to protect children from forced recruitment into armed conflict, and how human rights education can be an effective and preventive mechanism?
شكرا دكتورة هناء، وشكرا لمركز سلمان للإغاثة الإنسانية على تنظيم هذه يعني الندوة الهامة والتي تأتي في سياق يتسم ببعض الضبابية فيما يخص مستقبل التعليم في العالم، خاصة بعدما جاءت هذه الجائحة وتوقفنا على العديد من النقائص التي يمكن أن تشكل نوعا ما عائقا لبلوغ أهداف التنمية المستدامة 2030، وخاصة الهدف الرابع المتعلق بالتعليم الجيد المنصف والشامل للجميع وتعزيز فرص التعلم مدى الحياة الجميع. حقيقة سعدت كثيرا خلال الجلسة الأولى والجلسة الثانية لأن كان هناك تركيز كثير على مسألة التعليم، ولكن السؤال المطروح أي تعليم؟ لأنه لابد أن نركز على بعض التفاصيل المتعلقة بجودة هذا التعليم أو ماهية هذا التعليم الذي يجب أن نقدمه إلى الأطفال حتى يتم تحسينهم أو حتى يتم التوقي من هذه الظاهرة، يعني ظاهرة تجنيد الأطفال، وتمكينهم من الوسائل التي يمكن أن تكون لهم حصنا ضد هذه الظاهرة. لماذا نركز على التربية على ثقافة حقوق الإنسان كآلية ناجعة للوقاية من مخاطر التجنيد؟ فلأن لها أولا أسسها في أهداف التنمية من ناحية، ولكن أسسها في رؤية الإسيسكو لسنة 2030 لما قلنا أن الرؤية ترتكز على حقوق الإنسان والطفل، ولكن هناك أجندات أخرى منها أجندة إفريقيا 2063 لابد أن لا نتغافل عنها، والتي تأتي في تماهي تام مع ما تم الإعلان عنه في استراتيجيات الأمم المتحدة، ولكن في استراتيجيات العالم الإسلامي. نتحدث عن العالم الإسلامي خاصة إذا ما تبينا أن أكثر من 80% من الأطفال المجندين هم في هذا الفضاء، في فضاء العالم الإسلامي. يعني عندنا 300 مليون طفل مجند في العالم، 80% من هؤلاء الأطفال هم في يعني دولنا الأعضاء. يمكن كذلك ربط هذا العدد مع نسبة الأمية في العالم الإسلامي التي تبلغ 40%، والأخطر والأدهى من ذلك أن تصل نسبة الأمية لدى الفتيات والنساء 65%، وهذه أرقام حقا مفزعة، ولابد أن نقوم بمساعي كبيرة، وليست مساعي فقط من طرف منظمة أو دولة بمفردها، بل يجب أن تكون هناك مساعي متواصلة وأن تتعاون الدول والمنظمات من أجل يعني الخروج من هذه يعني الظلمة. أقولها صراحة لأن الأرقام مفزعة ومفزعة للغاية. نقول التربية على ثقافة حقوق الإنسان كآلية ناجعة للوقاية كذلك لأن لها أسس. فالإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان نص في ديباجته على أن كل فرد وهيئة في المجتمع يجب أن تسعى إلى توطيد احترام هذه الحقوق والحريات عن طريق التعليم والتربية. فهناك سند أولا جاء في هذا الميثاق، ثم أتت اتفاقية حقوق الطفل لسنة 89 ونصت على ذلك في موادها 28 و 29، وتقول المادة 29 من هذه الاتفاقية أنه توافق دول الأطراف على أن يكون تعليم الطفل موجها نحو تنمية احترام حقوق الإنسان والحريات الأساسية والمبادئ المكرسة في ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. فهناك سند كبير لهذا يعني المعطى أو لهذا المطلوب الذي يجب أن يدرج في المناهج التربوية حتى تكون نضمن جودة التعليم، لأن التعليم بمفرده فقط يعني لا يكفي إلى مجابهة هذه الظاهرة، بل يجب أن يدرج فيه كل ما يتعلق بحقوق الإنسان وخاصة حقوق الطفل التي ستمكن الطفل غدا من يعني الوسائل التي تحصنه ضد هذه الظواهر التي تدمر شخصية الطفل وتدمر نفسيته وتدمر طفولة الطفل. وهذا ما تعمل الإيسيسكو يعني حتى لا معناه يحصل، وحتى لا يكون هناك معناه يحصل ما لا يحمد عقباه. الأمم المتحدة نفسها ركزت على هذا المعطى من خلال العديد من المؤتمرات. أذكر هنا على سبيل الذكر وليس الحصر المؤتمر الدولي لحقوق الإنسان الذي عقد في فيينا، الذي أكد على الدور الضروري الذي تلعبه التربية على حقوق الإنسان والتدريب والمعلومات العامة في تحسيس هذه الحقوق. الجمعية العمومية للأمم المتحدة كذلك في عشرية الأمم المتحدة على حقوق الإنسان أكدت كذلك على أهمية إدراج هذا يعني المعطى يعني حقوق الإنسان في المناهج التربوية، وقرارات مجلس حقوق الإنسان وغيرها من القرارات التي تركز على إدراج هذه يعني المنظومة الكاملة في تكاملها وفي شموليتها في المناهج التربوية. نقول ذلك لأننا في الإيسيسكو انطلقنا في تجربة رائدة الآن مع المغرب، وخلال الاتفاقية التي أبرمناها ركزنا على مراجعة التشريعات الخاصة بالنظم التعليمية يعني النظام التعليمي في المغرب، والآن ندرس معهم كيفية إدراج هذه يعني المواد في المناهج وكيفية كذلك مراجعة التشريعات. ونقول أن بعض التحديات التي تواجه يعني هذا المعطى منها هل ستكون هذه المواد إجبارية أم اختيارية، المستويات هل ستكون على مستوى أساسي ثانوي عالي مهني، كذلك لابد من يعني أخذ هذه المعطيات بعين الاعتبار، بناء قدرات المعلمين الأساتذة والمتفقدين وجميع الكوادر التربوية، وكذلك هل ستكون التجربة عمومية أم سننطلق من تجربة رائدة عن طريق المدارس أولية ثم نعممها على بقية المدارس. هذه بعض التخمينات والمعطيات، ولكن لابد من الانطلاق فيها ولابد من تنزيلها على أرض الواقع مع دولنا الأعضاء.
Thank you so much, Mr. Spaley. I'm not a professional interpreter, but briefly I will highlight some of the Mr. Spaley's intervention. So he mentioned that 80% of child soldier in Islamic countries, and this links to the illiteracy in the Arab world, let's say. 65% of them are women and girls. So the cooperation is needed to have a better future for these people. The numbers are shocking. So to enhance the right, to enhance the children's rights, the human rights principle should be integrated in the education system. And also ISISCO works hard to prevent the repercussions by trying to enhance the education system. And he mentioned one of their experiences with Morocco, and to review the education system and how to embed this curriculum in the education system. They face until now many challenges, including should it be compulsory or optional? Should it be applied on all schools or specific schools? Thank you so much, Mr. Spaley. Dr. Al-Aufi, talking about education, how would you ensure that students remain in schools, and what are the alternative plans to ensure there is no educational gap occurs in these emergency circumstances?
شكرا دكتورة هناء. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Thank you. I would like to thank King Salman Center and the organizers for this for this panel discussion. And we'll present from the perspective of education perspective, the efforts and solution the Ministry of Education implemented during this pandemic on regards of the children educational journey in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, based on activating the national regulations and policies and international agreements signed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which align with the child protection regulation and admitted by Islamic law, especially in regards of ensuring the right of child's education, as also this being sought by the Ministry of Education with the support of His Excellency, the Minister of Education, and our leadership to ensure the continuity of education for everyone. This was stated and confirmed by the United Nations, as my colleague said, as the SDGs 4 Sustainable Development Goal, especially in the fourth goal, that means ensuring quality, equitable, and inclusive education for everyone, and enhancing lifelong learning opportunities for everyone despite the emergency status facing the country and the world due to the pandemic. Let's take for a view quick for based on the data. In the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there are over 6 million students taught in different type of schools, in which includes public, private, and international schools. Among them, students from other countries who were affected from armed conflict. There are, more like 1,070,000 students, which the Ministry of Education aims to provide the educational service in different regions in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Ministry of Education also has made exceptional efforts to mitigate the effects of the coronavirus in order to achieve and guarantee the continuation for the remote educational process for more than 7 million students. We are talking about students in different sectors, schools, universities, and technical and vocational training. Also, we can review about the most prominent achievement of the Ministry of Education during the regulation to complete educational journey as follows. The ministry implement its internal emergency and crisis management plans, developing of an alternative plan for distance learning education, such as virtual kindergarten for ECE, early childhood education, and also Madrasati platform, and also the National Education Portal, AIN satellite channel, which includes 23 channels for the whole system of education, adding at YouTube channels. Focus on basic and professional knowledge in the curriculum. And if we are talking about the alternative plans to ensure there is no educational loss or gaps occur in these emergency circumstances, the ministry has worked with the relevant sectors and entities to activate social responsibility to reach to all students in coordination with the Ministry of Communication, media officials, and the families to support its children for a successful educational journey, as well as the community partnership with the Takaful Foundation in providing devices for registered students. That was done to ensure all students, regardless of their circumstances, have access to my school, that's Madrasati platform, and other interactive platform. Providing support to students and educating families and the community to overcome difficulties that could hinder their psychological and educational needs, to adapt to their community, and to also to achieve belonging and to promote mental health through student counseling, awareness campaigns, and educational and health guidance. Let's say in conclusion, we're so proud really for the Saudi online education model, and the teachers' effort and their dedication to educate, despite the changing circumstances, along with the students' keenness, as well as their families' support to take upon a responsibility for their own learning. All efforts that been mentioned and that been previously mentioned will help preventing really the vulnerable children from being victims or being, let's say, used and taken advantage of in different ways. Thank you all. This is, I think, maybe will answer the question. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Aufi. So we would like to talk about this topic from the ICRC perspective. Ms. Morphy, what are some good practices in both prevention of child recruitment and in successful child reintegration?
Thank you very much, Dr. Hannah, and thank you very much for having me and the International Committee of the Red Cross to join the discussion today. So what I would like to do is discuss first one example of a good practice regarding prevention and then one example regarding reintegration. So 2 examples, but before I do that, what I'd like to do is really emphasize that, you know, we have the luxury on this particular subject of extremely detailed and strong and clear international law and standards. And that doesn't happen on all subjects in the humanitarian sector. So regarding child recruitment, I speak, of course, of the optional protocol, which we've already mentioned today in the discussion, the optional protocol on children in armed conflict. Article 6 specifically requires states parties to take steps to successfully reintegrate children who've been unlawfully recruited. Article 7 specifically obliges states to cooperate to that end. And aside from the optional protocol, we also have the Paris Principles and commitments on children associated with armed forces and armed groups. And this set of standards is extremely detailed, extremely clear. I note that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has endorsed these standards. And so I guess to begin with, I think what I should say is what we have is the tools, and what we really need to think about is how to implement these tools. So moving first to the first example of good practice, which is on the prevention of recruitment. Now, I will emphasize here one quite critical element of effective prevention, which is the implementation in domestic law and policies of the applicable international standards. So we have these strong standards at the international level, and it's critical that they are implemented into domestic frameworks. Dr. Hind has already so eloquently set out the steps that are taken at Saudi national level to really make these strong standards work in practice in domestic context. So, of course, this is only one piece of the puzzle. It's the domestic framework. It is not the cultural work that needs to be done. It is not the many more steps that need to be done to really effectively prevent recruitment. But it is a very necessary piece because it sets out the normative framework. It orients training and dissemination, and ultimately it would form the basis for future accountability. So this piece of work in terms of translating international standards into domestic level frameworks is very core to the ICRC's work. To give a couple of examples in this regard, the ICRC's Advisory Service in International Humanitarian Law works with states to shape domestic legislation on the issue of child recruitment as well as on other subjects. So, for example, we have worked recently with other partners as well and the government of Bahrain, who adopted a law on international crimes in 2018, which included the recruitment of children under the age of 18 as a war crime. We similarly have worked with the UAE on their international crimes law, which also includes the crime of child recruitment. So that's the example of, or the critical core piece of prevention when it comes to child recruitment. Turning now to one aspect which I'd like to emphasize on the reintegration of child recruits. And here, what I want to focus on is the importance, but also the complexity of restoring and maintaining family links. So this is something that the ICRC works on, and it is also very much reflected in the Paris Principles. There's clear standards and good practices on ensuring that you're not only working with the child to reintegrate the child, you are also working with their family members and indeed the wider community. And it's very much that context that is critical to ensure that reintegration works in the longer term. So, for example, the Paris Principles set out that the family and community generally provide the most effective protection for children. So, in reintegration processes, every effort should be made to keep children with their families or to reunite them and place them within a family context. The Red Crescent National Societies and the ICRC can play a role in this. So, for example, we currently work with children in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo who have been released from armed groups. And what we do there is for a range of things, but we identify their relatives, we then prepare the children, but also their parents and also the community for family reunification. And a critical part of these programs is also providing children with skills to ease their reintegration and make a living once they have returned. So this could be tailoring, growing crops, herding small cattle. And I think I'll conclude by emphasizing that, you know, this is really not an easy task. Obviously, and I think as others have spoken about today, accepting the children that can raise fears for parents and communities. Have the children changed? Have they become violent? How will they behave? And that's why I think this really holistic approach to not just working with the child, but really preparing with the family and with the wider community is really critical. So thank you very much, and back to you, Dr. Hannah.
Thank you so much for this great highlights that you shared with us. So talking about this issue from the Saudi Red Crescent Authority perspective, Councillor Aroueli, from your experience, how we can enhance child protection in armed conflict, and what are the procedures when a child soldier is captured?
Thank you, Dr. Hannah. Thank you, King Salman Humanitarian Center, to give me this opportunity to be among this distinguished panelists. And it's a very important issue and very timely issue as well. I think it's hard to add after the whole distinguished panelists before me, the experts in different aspects. I think I try to add something valuable to here and to take some advantage of it. Actually, the Saudi Red Crescent and the National Committee of International Humanitarian Law, we have a partnership and coordination with the different aspects, different entities here in Saudi Arabia to make sure to follow and respect the international law and regarded to the children protection especially. For example, at the IHL committee, with our 12 partners from different ministries and authorities in Saudi Arabia, we have advocacy role to discuss and have the open dialogue, especially with the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior, as a partner and members of that committee. We trying to make sure the legislation base and the legal base of the protection to be respected and established in Saudi Arabia in the good and best ways all the time. I think when we're talking about how to enhance the prevention of child recruitment, child soldier recruitment, I think we have a triangle. We call it sometimes with my colleague as a golden triangle. Ending poverty, I think it's very important, and the main element in this issue, I think, is the source of the circumstances that's coming after, especially the recruitment of the children. Most of those children, for two things, they are recruited, and they accept to be recruited in that group and some of the armies. One of them is the poverty, the poorness. They need financial needs to support their families and support themselves. And another way in some areas, the culture itself encourage those children to become soldiers. It's part of the honor that kind of those societies. We're trying with our colleague to be aligned with education and to discuss with our colleague from the Ministry of Education as a part of that committee, the Saudi committee of IHL, to add more subjects on the education system to aware and to give knowledge for those children about how it's to deal with the arms as a play game. It's very dangerous, and we're trying to educate by our friend from different aspects to publish through the media and through the especially the new media to aware the families and the parents about some of the games which is give the children attraction to be to use the arms, to use the guns. Some of those some of those dialogue, I think, the fruiting more knowledge and more respect to prevent the root of the to make it as a attraction issue for the children by preventing it from the sources. And another part of another corner of that triangle is the education. I think, as I mentioned my colleague before me, the education is very important for two ways. One of them to cut the chain of the poverty by education, to give more opportunities for the children, boys and girls, to become better, to give them a better future, and education to give them the life. The life is not to. There is a hope at the end of the tunnel, as Dr. Rabia mentioned before, to give him goal in their life better than to be to show themselves by using the arms, or using how to be part of the war game. I think in this different aspects we can also by enforce the good and solid legislation base and legal fundamental on the country by adopting and respecting the international norms and instruments and conventions. For example, in Saudi Arabia now we are preparing, as my colleague mentioned, Bahrain and UAE, we are working now in the final touches actually in the international crime law to adapt it on the national legal system. That's what we are working with our colleague, the Minister of Defense, and another different aspects to give him the advices and the coordination. And also we can say we are part and sometimes in the advisory work with those aspects. For example, we are part of the child protection unit. We are part of the legal advisory group, which given advice and give consideration for our leader of the militaries, and we are actually receiving some of the legal questions and legal requirement and to answer and to give that advice, which minimize sometimes the errors and the collateral damage during the war. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ruwaili, for this extensive intervention. Back to Mr. Williams. So in general, how would you prevent any stigmatization for children who have exited armed forces? Here I'm talking especially for girls. As you know, sometimes it's a very sensitive issue. And in 2017, a report by the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children Armed Conflict indicates that 40% of children who are recruited in armed conflict are girls. What are the specific challenges facing girls associated with armed forces, and what are some good practices for their reintegration?
Thank you, Dr. Hannah. First, it's important to note that girls as a group are largely overlooked in this situation. You know, despite the significant number of girls who participate in hostilities or perform other supportive role while associated with armed forces and groups. And I have witnessed it personally, right? I mean, in the West Africa conflict, that's Sahelian Liberia, Ivory Coast, and parts of Guinea, we used to say, where are the girls? In northern Uganda, we used to ask the question, where are the girls? Right? Because the girls were largely invisible. But I'll talk about that as we go ahead. Girls have unique experience and therefore unique needs and vulnerabilities that must be accounted for in any programming for prevention, release, and reintegration. You spoke about the 40%, but our data shows that actually, again, 75% of the conflict today involves recruitment of children, half of which include girls. The data also tells us that the longer a conflict continues, the more likely girls are to be recruited and exploited by armed actors. Often girls are abducted. We have seen the case over and over. There's a famous case in Uganda, the famous case in Nigeria, right? The famous case in the Iraq-Syria conflict, right? They're also forced to marry adult males, fighters, and to live under their control. And they're often subjected to daily sexual violence. We've seen all that in the media. But like boys, some girls have severely limited options. Ultimately, they decide to join the armed forces or group, as it's the best way forward. They may join to protect themselves from other violence in their families or communities. They may join to generate income for themselves and their families. They may join to avenge loss of loved ones in conflict or to follow other family members or partners. And they may return to an armed actor or armed group after leaving because of poor treatment, discrimination, or, as you rightly mentioned, stigma that they face when they return to their communities. Their roles actually in these groups also vary. Some girls may be active participants in the conflict. In Africa, for example, just as you mentioned, 40% of the girls recruited recruited by armed forces and groups directly engage in hostilities, but they also act in supporting roles. They are cooks, they are medical assistants, they are telecommunication operators, and they're responsible for cleaning. And girls often survive extensive, repeated, life-threatening sexual abuse and torture during their period of association. Although our information on girls has improved in recent years, still relatively few are formally identified. And often because of the serious stigma that they experience. So they usually like to hide themselves. They don't like to come out, right? While stigma is also present for boys, girls in particular can experience destructive stigma and ostracization, even from their own families, when returning to their communities, sometimes with their own children who may have been conceived as a result of rape. So what can we do? You asked that question. What are the best practices? First, we must start with government, humanitarian and human rights actors, putting real muscles and resources into learning where girls are in situation of armed conflict. Safely collecting data to understand, one, the nature and reason for recruitment and use of girls by armed forces and groups. Two, the experience that girls have during their period of association. Three, the impact of their experience on them. Four, what they need and don't need. Remember that point. It's not only what they need, also what they don't need, what they don't want, as sometimes people project on them, as they exist armed forces or groups. From a preventive perspective, this allows us to better address the risk factors that lead girls to associate with armed actors at the individual, family, and community level. From a response perspective, this allows us to provide girls with long-term support that promotes sustainable reintegration that both addresses their experience and prevents re-recruitment. Working with communities of return to reduce stigma, shame resulting from their exploitation is also a key component of work. Working more systematically, linking programs for release and reintegration with gender-based violence response services, including specialized medical care and psychosocial support, is critical. In the fourth session, I listened when UNFPA was talking about it. And finally, but not least important, it means engaging directly with the girls as agents of their lives, so they have choices to make that are meaningful to them and their families. I end at that point, Dr. Hannah.
Thank you so much for these important points, and definitely understanding their needs will help to have the appropriate solutions and possible and successful reintegration. So back to Ms. O'Hara, tell us more about children who have been recruited beyond their borders and how UNHCR can help them to go back, especially if they're returning to their camps can put them more at risk.
Thank you, Hannah, and it's been most interesting listening to all of the complementary inputs and expertise of this very experienced panel. When you talk about children who have been recruited beyond borders of their home country, this gives rise to a number of different situations in which the United Nations High Commissioner may be involved. First of all, there's the question of if children have been recruited potentially out of a refugee situation, as I discussed in my earlier intervention, but let's say also out of their home country, and they find themselves in a foreign country where they're caught up in some type of conflict, even maybe involved in armed groups that are considered internationally as terrorist groups. Now, UNHCR can become involved on a number of different levels. Firstly, if children in that situation were originally refugees and they were taken out of refugee situations, that's one of the examples where UNHCR still has a duty of care towards those children and have to help them to be taken out of those situations. Secondly, there may be scenarios where children have been recruited into armed groups abroad. They have then been identified and they have been taken out of those armed groups, that may be with the help of UNICEF or other expert agencies. And those children may fear return to their home countries because they've now been tainted, they've now been identified as having been involved with fighting forces, in the worst case scenario, potentially involved in terrorist action. And they may fear return to their home countries because they fear that when they get back, they will be stigmatized, as other interveners said, or they may be prosecuted. Now, in some situations of that nature, they may seek asylum abroad. They may seek to engage with UNHCR and seek international protection as an outcome to their situation. And that's one way UNHCR may become involved. However, it is very important to understand that the way international refugee law works, it does not extend protection to people who are afraid not of persecution, but of prosecution. So where we find children who have been caught up in the activities of armed groups and potentially taken abroad, when we look at their protection needs, we look at them sometimes through the possibility of their recognition as refugees, but refugee law also says if you have been involved in criminal activities, you cannot benefit from protection as a refugee, and you should be able to go home, even if that means you might face prosecution for the potential crimes you were involved in. And my colleague Cornelius spoke to that earlier, that children may legitimately have to be prosecuted for crimes they have committed. And then our responsibility from a human rights perspective is to ensure that they get full coverage of due process, and that they are not, that they are given proper treatment and that their experience as children who were most likely forcibly recruited into armed groups is taken into account in the way they are treated when prosecution may come to the fore. There is, however, Hannah, and I will make this second point and then pass back to you, there is another example in which UNHCR may become involved in the situation of children who have somehow been recruited abroad, who want to return home, and whose home countries are not cooperating in the possibility of their return home. And this is a much lesser known, I think, part of UNHCR's mandate, which links to statelessness. And what we have seen in operational practice with children who have been recruited and taken abroad, sometimes by their own parents, and they may be now stuck abroad. They want to get home. This is more the case of children and even women associated with armed groups or terrorist organizations. They want to go home. The home country of their nationality does not want to accept them back. We have seen a growing trend of some states actually depriving people of their nationality, canceling passports, and refusing to allow people to come home. And from the perspective of UNHCR's mandate on statelessness, this is completely unacceptable. People should not be left, particularly women and children, they should not be left stranded in squalid camps abroad. They should be allowed by their home countries to return and reintegrate. And this is a common message across the UN, that when we look at women and children who have been caught up in recruitment and end up with groups abroad, that part of the solution on the basis of international cooperation between states should be to proactively allow those people to come home and be reintegrated, not to leave them stranded in very squalid locations abroad, where the risk of them, I mean, this creates a complete lost generation of children that have potentially, some of them even been born into situations of camps abroad where they are associated with armed groups, and these children should not be left stranded there. They should have the possibility of going home. Back to you, Hannah.
Thank you so much for your valuable insight. Actually, I was wondering if this case can happen, and thank you for giving us the possible solutions not to leave them stranded. So back to ICRC, Ms. Murphy. Alleviating their suffering during the post-conflict wouldn't be easy, that's for sure, as all of you have shared with us. These children may experience psychological trauma. What are the significant challenges that hinder the successful of their reintegration?
Thank you, Hannah. And of course, it's a huge question. What challenges are there for reintegration? So what I will do is focus on one particular challenge that we see at the ICRC. So an important challenge that we see is that child recruits who are detained and who at times face criminal prosecution for their mere association with a given armed group are often forgotten and left behind when it comes to reintegration. Now, I wonder, I hear a little bit of an echo in my room. Okay, wonderful. I do not hear it anymore, so thank you. So what I was emphasizing was there's a particular challenge when it comes to children who are detained and who might face criminal prosecution. As we've just heard, it may be valid in certain circumstances for children to be prosecuted for acts that they have committed, but it is our strong view at the ICRC that they should not face criminal prosecution for their mere association with the armed group. So they should not be prosecuted for having been recruited. That was a crime that was committed upon them rather than in reverse. So when children are recruited and they then are fighting with a particular armed group, it happens often and in many different conflicts occurring today, that armed forces then capture children fighting with the opposing force. And what this means is that children can end up remaining in detention for prolonged periods of time. Actually, I will point to a report recently released by my colleagues in UNICEF, who highlighted actually that some good news came out of the pandemic over the last year, which is that at least 37 different countries provided for the release of children from detention during the pandemic, because situations of detention are such a risk for children generally, but in particular because of the health risks brought by the pandemic. So actually over the last year, we've seen the release of a lot of children from the detention. That's some good news. But the bad news is that a particular category of children, several categories, but one of those categories has really been left behind from that release. And this really feeds into this group of children really being forgotten. And those are children who are detained for national security concerns, sometimes because they're associated with a group that's been designated as terrorist, and children who might be in military detention, children in detention generally for their association with an armed group. So this is the group of children that are very often forgotten and that don't benefit, therefore, from reintegration measures. So they're children who've been recruited, but they're still in detention, and it's very difficult for them to even get to the point of reintegration and deal with the challenges that come with reintegration because there's this blockage. So a key challenge is therefore to ensure that domestic law does not create these categories of children who might be detained for mere association with an armed group, whether that's for terrorism-related charges or other national security-related reasons. Because what that does is it prevents those children from, first of all, simply being released and therefore afterwards moving on to reintegration. One way to achieve this is to put in place handover protocols to facilitate that release so that when children are identified in detention, they are then released and handed over to child protection actors. So basically, I'll leave that by emphasizing that it's important when we talk about reintegration to ensure that we're talking about all children. As Cornelius has already emphasized, girls are often forgotten. Where are the girls? And also children in detention are a category that is often left behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I apologize, we ran out of time, I think, but it's a really valuable input, and we really enjoyed this discussion. So back to you, Dr. Khalifa. Can you tell us briefly about the Child Soldier Rehabilitation and Reintegration Program?
Okay, as it's been said and discussed, this I don't know if that, can you hear me? There is like, okay. It's a complex issue. Children are with different categories, and we have to deal with this in various ways. Maybe the holistic, adapting the holistic approach during the conflict. This is what King Salman Relief Center has adapted and implemented. The children associated armed groups. I'm sorry, is there echo in the voice? Because it's really noisy for me. When I talk, do you hear me clearly, or maybe when?
Yes, we hear you clearly. I'm not hearing any echo at all when you speak. You should continue.
Okay. Okay, because I can't hear myself. Okay, so King Salman Humanitarian Relief Center adopted and implemented the children associated with the armed groups integration programs in Yemen. This is a qualitative humanitarian project which began in Marab in September 2017. The program provides a variety of services to former children associated with the armed groups. The objective of it is to help children to re-enter society and return to school. It accomplishes these goals by providing psychological and social services for children and their families to help normalize their lives. Also, the program aims to raise awareness among parents about the danger of child recruitment and to help them find ways to create a safe, healthy home environment. So the types of reintegration provided by the program are psychological care, social reintegration, educational support, physical education and sport, art, drawing, also cultural and theoretical activities. There is also post reintegration follow-up after the children have completed the resident period of the program. The social workers and other specialists continue to monitor their progress at school and at home, and follow-up reports are prepared in order to determine the long-term outcome of each child participation. This program has two versions. The first one started from 2017 until the end of 2019. The result of this program was the number of beneficiaries is 11,040 family members and 480 children. The first version was focusing on children and family, and was aiming to reintegrate both families and children. I'm gonna just shorten what I wanted to say because I know the time. However, the second one was improvement of the first experience, and it started in September 2020. The beneficiaries until now 100 children and 100 parents and 50,000 indirect beneficiaries. At this stage, it wasn't only children and families, but also government entities and civil society organization and the society as whole. So here, more of adoption of a holistic approach in trying to help children and families, and the community is more involved, and other agencies. And also the objectives here were educating communities as well as the children and families. We also providing training for family members, reintegration of children into their families and community, psychological services, and health services.
Thank you.
The impact, I don't know if there is time for the impacts. We can
like for 1 minute, because we're running out of time. I apologize again to everyone here.
It's the empowerment of children in education, psychology, also the empowering of family, because here there is a close work with the family too, in the economic and also in the social, and the society is also promote and engaged in promoting an end for child recruitment and other civil society department and our organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalifa, for talking more and elaborating more about this great project that we would like to see in different countries. So back to the education role, Dr. Ibrahim, talking about negative impacts on children associated with armed conflict or groups, how education can be a tool to strengthen their psychological well-being, and how culture specifically can affect that issue, as we saw in the first session. His Excellency Dr. Rabia and Her Excellency Dr. Kita mentioned the importance of culture.
Yes, education in itself, getting children that affected by any kind of what you call non-normal cases, war, whatever circumstances, getting them in education is a psychosocial kind of relief. Education is a hope in itself. hope for them, giving the children hope that there is life, they will progress, they will have life like other children. It's a psychosocial relief for them. Also, the program in schools, getting them to play with each other, to social cohesion, what we always advise in these circumstances, using art, using music, using songs, also give relief from the trauma, from what they face. Education also give what we call a sense of normalcy and structure, that they are normal children. They play with other children. We see actually from our examples, either with King Salman projects and other projects, we see it's a sense also of settlement for families, for local community. When children face internal displacement or getting to be refugees, the first question by the families and the community, where are the schools? How they can get some sense of learning, of education. So this, once children are getting education, they settle in the place, they settle in the country. So education is really giving them a sense of settlement, a sense of peace in the mind of the children and of the local community. Just I want to give some kind of way forward quickly, Hannah, if you allow me. And also I'll give example of from our joint project, what is called Peace. Education is Peace. It's a regional project actually, specialized in the area of building resources for the Arab state, in particular for countries in crisis, which helped the region actually to get to this kind of education in emergency, which is different than what normal education. So we are building together a guide, regional guide in psychosocial for teachers, self-learning for teachers, how they can deal with children who are facing difficulties, how teacher can listen to the voice of the teacher, how he or she can deal with these children who are not in normal cases. We are doing also what we call flexible learning, which is missing in most of our education in Arab states. Flexible learning means you need to give, as a system, another opportunity for education for the children to get back to schooling again, which even in what we call European countries, 20% of the children in their countries, although they live normal life, they always get to this what we call second chance opportunity. Non-formal learning is very important here as one way of psychosocial relief, as or getting also education. Another thing that also among us as donors, as international community, coordination is very important for our work. Sometimes there is duplication in our work. So working together, a holistic approach, as mentioned before, is one way of really trying to recover from all these problems. I will stop here in order that the time will allow me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim. Dr. Al-Aufi, can you tell us briefly about the initiative and the efforts to ensure the continuity of education?
Okay, I will be brief, Dr. Hannah, because of the time running. So I think let's us mention one of the ministry plans is to make online education through digital platforms and digital educational content as a strategic choice as part of the Kingdom Educational Future Plans, providing the electronic alternatives throughout the year to be as open sources to achieve equal opportunities, educational equality, and accessibility for all children. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So for accessibility, when you mention it, is it for all students or?
Yes, it will be for all group of children, no one left behind.
Thank you so much. So, Councillor Rueli, we would like to know more about the efforts that you would like to enhance or to strengthen for child soldier rehabilitation and reintegration efforts here in Saudi Arabia.
Actually, here in Saudi Arabia, we make sure when the some of those culture, you know, we are in the eastern end of the Saudi border of Saudi Arabia. We have a conflict sometimes. Some of the child soldiers came from the Yemen. It's captured and they crossed the border and they captured by the authorities in Saudi Arabia. They're starting the rehabilitation and reintegration with those children, especially on the detained centers in the south of Saudi Arabia. Actually, we have a dialogue and we have a consultation with the authorities of Saudi Arabia to make sure those detained centers it's convenient for those children, and we make sure with the legal advisory on the military to become those centers according to the international standards and the special case of those children. They started with them by the, as we said before, the social, the psychosocial support. They started with them at that centers. Then we try to reintegrate them by giving them some of education and to handle them to their parents and for the authorities inside the Yemen, or sometimes they are choosing to be part of the King Salman Humanitarian Rehabilitation Center by themselves or by asking from their parents to reintegrate them. Actually, those efforts started from the detained, and we are make sure and we are witnesses the detainees from those child soldiers to become their journey and their detained period. It's very short, and to make sure to return back as soon as they can. And we are witness many of those cases. I think more than 200 of those children recruited by the Houthis military group, and return back to the Marib or the areas they are choosing, they're willing to be live and with the dialogue and with the discuss and with coordination with the King Salman Humanitarian Center to give the aid and rehabilitate them and reintegrate them to the society. And why those efforts coming from the Saudi Arabia? It's not just for the, it's very important to be for the humanitarian, to the rights of those children, but we are investing actually on the peace inside the Yemen, and the peace on the border, and the peace in this region, and they call it the peace on the whole the world. And we have bad examples actually came from Afghanistan, Somalia, South America. When we leave those children and leave them behind without reintegration and rehabilitation and give them a hope, as I said before, I think we have the bad example. I don't need to mention it, and I think it's obvious for all of us what happened in Afghanistan and Somalia. It's bad example to say. For that, we are investing as a Saudi Arabia government, as Saudi Arabia by the humanitarian arms such as King Salman Humanitarian Center, which give very tremendous role in this special area, not just in Yemen, in Syria, Lebanon, and different parts of the world. We are proud to say this efforts and how it's professional way, and the example of the successful example of those reintegration children and how they come back to their normal life or the similar of their normal life. I think that it's very fruitful, and we are proud to be part of those efforts in this special cases, special arena of humanitarian work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Councillor Roueli. It's important to know these efforts because now we have the conflict or the armed conflict between the Houthis and the Yemenis and how it affects the situation in Yemen, and especially for children who are vulnerable, and how we would like to see this successful reintegration for these children who are associated with our conflict, to see it in different countries, as you mentioned, like in Afghanistan or everywhere, because the main goal is to keep these children safe and protected, and to keep to live their own life, and to be a child or a normal child. They have their own rights. So we would like to hear the final thought from Mr. Sahili. So from Cape Town principles to Paris principles, and now on the table we hear the Vancouver. We know about the Vancouver principles. In ISISCO, what are the preliminary reference for your work?
شكرا دكتورة هناء. بالنسبة لعملية الإدماج الاجتماعي للأطفال ضحايا عمليات التجنيد، هي عملية مركبة ومعقدة وتستوجب التحضير. وردت ولكن عرج عليها البروتوكول الاختياري لاتفاقية حقوق الطفل بشأن اشتراك الأطفال في المنازعات المسلحة، ثم جاءت مبادئ كيب تاون وأكملتها مبادئ والتزامات باريس في سنة 2007، ولكن يعني تم تفصيلها، وممكن حتى على مستوى الإسيسكو قمنا بدراسة أو دراسة حالة وطبقنا من خلالها بعض المعايير لمعرفة إن كانت يعني على المستوى الميداني، يعني في بعض المناطق مثل نيجيريا، اليمن، أفغانستان وبعض دول الساحل والصحراء التي تعاني من هذه الظاهرة، هل يتم تطبيقها بطريقة ناجعة أم لا؟ تبين أن بعض الأشياء التي لم تؤخذ في عين الاعتبار في عملية الإدماج، ونذكر منها خاصة وأهمها عملية التحضير لهذه العملية، لأن المبادئ تنص على أنه يجب أن يبتدئ التحضير لبرامج دعم تسريح الأطفال وإعادة إدماجهم فور اتضاح ارتباك أطفال بقوات مسلحة أو جماعات مسلحة. يعني قبل ما يتم التسريح لابد من التحضير إلى هذه العملية، ويعني حتى تتوفر على الضمانات وعدات النجاح. عملية التحضير لم تكن حسب يعني ما قمنا به من دراسات هنا في الإسيسكو، لم تكن بالشكل المطلوب، ولم تكن يعني بالشكل الذي يستجيب إلى المعايير التي جاءت بها كيب تاون وأكملتها التزامات ومبادئ اتفاقية مبادئ باريس. فهذه لمحة أولى. ممهدات النجاح يعني عملية التأهيل الاجتماعي والاندماج الاجتماعي ترتكز بالخصوص على التأهيل النفسي أولا، ثم تدريب الأولياء على تسهيل عملية الاندماج، لأن العملية ليست عملية منفردة تهم فقط الأطفال الضحايا، بل تهم شبكات أوسع، أولها الأولياء ثم كذلك المجتمع المحلي، لأنه لابد أن نأخذ بعين الاعتبار أن هذا المجتمع كذلك يعاني من رواسب النزاعات المسلحة، فلابد في عملية إعادة إدماج الأطفال أن نأخذ بعين الاعتبار هذين يعني المعطيين، المعطى الداخلي يعني الأولياء الأقارب، ثم المعطى يعني الأشمل وهو المجتمع المحلي. ولا بد هنا من الإشادة بالدور الذي يجب أن تلعبه مجتمعات يعني المجتمع المدني أو يعني الجمعيات الأهلية التي لا بد أن تساهم وتنخرط بشكل فعال في عملية إدماج، لأنه لابد من الإشارة أنه هنا يعني نتحدث عن فئة هشة، فئة لابد من مراعاة حساسيتها يعني الطفل. شيء آخر كذلك في عملية الإدماج الاجتماعي والتأهيل الذي لابد أن نأخذه بعين الاعتبار هو يتعلق بالنوع الاجتماعي، لأن هناك لابد أن نأخذ بعين الاعتبار أن نولي أهمية قصوى إلى إعادة إدماج الفتيات لأنه نعرف أن التأثير يعني النزاعات المسلحة أو عمليات التجنيد ليس مثيلا بين الذكور والإناث، فالفتيات يتأثرن أكثر من هذه الظاهرة، ولا بد في إعادة تمجيهن أن يتم أخذ يعني كل الاحتياطات اللازمة وإيلاء هذه يعني الفئة الأهمية القصوى. هنا تجربة لابد من تثمينها، هي تجربة المملكة العربية السعودية عن طريق كذلك خاصة مركز سلمان للإغاثة، حيث قام في إطار مشروع إعادة تأهيل الأطفال المجندين والمتأثرين بالنزاع المسلح في اليمن. يعني هذا البرنامج استفاد منه أكثر من 530 طفل، وهذا شيء يستحق التنويه. وبالنسبة لمن استفاد بطريقة غير مباشرة يصل العدد يعني أولياء الأمور إلى 66560 عائلة، وهذه خطوة تستوجب الشكر والتقدير والإشادة، ولابد من العمل على تثمين هذه التجربة، ولابد كذلك من تعميمها على بقية الدول التي تعاني من هذه الظاهرة. وأنا أرى أن دور الإيسيسكو في هذا تشكل الإيسيسكو منصة بين التجربة يعني التجارب الناجحة مثل تجربة المملكة العربية السعودية ويعني بعض الدول الأخرى اللي هي أعضاء في الإيسيسكو، فلابد من العمل على تثمين هذه التجربة وتعميمها، وإن شاء الله سيكون، وإن شاء الله نتمنى أن يكون في مشروع شراكة مستقبلية بين الإيسيسكو ومركز سلمان للإغاثة الإنسانية. وشكرا.
Thank you again, Mr. Suhaili. Again, I'm not an official interpreter, so I will try my best, to highlight the main points. So Mr. Suhaili focused more that reintegration is very complicated. ISISCO scrutinized some case studies in Nigeria, Yemen, and Africa, whether to see the problem, and they found that the preparation phase is missing. The process itself is not aligned with Cape Town and Paris principles. Reintegration, according to the ISISCO, based on the psychological rehabilitation, not only for children, but including parents and the community in the reintegration process in general. And it should be more like a holistic approach, and girls' reintegration should be taken into account. That is different from boys' reintegration. And he also talked about the Saudi effort, especially KS Relief and the child soldier rehabilitation, that this program should be highlighted and we can reapply it in different countries. And he welcomed to work with KS Relief to see this possibility in the future, because now over 500 children have been rehabilitated. Thank you all for your valuable insight and discussion. And it's obvious that this topic cannot be covered in few hours. Sessions like this should be done frequently among the pertinent entities. I really thank you all, and sorry for taking much of your time. And back to my colleague Al-Jawhara.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hana, and I'd also like to extend my thanks to all distinguished panelists for such an insightful and fruitful discussion on the topic of children in armed conflict, which certainly requires great attention and tremendous collective action. We have now come to the last segment of the event this evening, our virtual event this evening, in which we will present the panel discussion recommendations. So I will hand it over back to you, Dr. Hana, to present the panel discussion recommendations and the closing remarks for this evening. Thank you.
Thanks again, Al-Jawhara. So, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude this informative and productive event with great recommendations that can contribute to end the use of children in armed conflict. First, utilizing the International Day Against the Use of Child Soldier as an opportunity to shed light on this phenomenon and develop a deeper understanding and awareness of the security, social, humanitarian, and legal repercussions of child recruitment. For the international community to support the recommendation of the Global Coalition for Reintegration of Child Soldier under the supervision of the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. Third, unifying and directing joint efforts to ensure respect for international humanitarian law and relevant international laws, such as the Convention on the Right of the Child and its optional protocols, and in particular, the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflicts. Improving aid coordination and coherence by the international community in order to address that issue and provide appropriate support and funding for programs and initiatives against child recruitment at all preventive, curative, and developmental levels to ensure sustainable reintegration of former children associated with armed forces or armed groups. Enhancing the participation of all concerned parties, for example, children, their families, their communities, government, national civil society organization, UN organizations, in designing, implementing, and evaluating programs and policies for responding to child recruitment, in order to ensure their effectiveness at the local and international levels, providing an adequate level of sustainable community-based reintegration with the aim of enabling children to regain their rights through educational and professional opportunities and eventually to become peace builders in their own communities. Focusing on reintegration program to reduce the stigma related to child association with armed forces or armed groups, and expediting reunification of released children with their families while providing the families with all required form of psychological, social, and economic support. Emphasizing the need to protect girls from the threat of recruitment and to address the humanitarian needs of girls who have exited armed forces or groups. And finally, strengthening the presence of children in peace-building dialogues and process at local, regional, and international levels. Sorry, there is another one. Maximizing the use of programs against child recruitment to protect children from all forms of maltreatment or exploitation. Again, thanks for our distinguished panelists today, and also thank you to everyone behind the screen watching us. We hope this event shed the light on child exploitation in armed conflict and emphasized the importance of collective effort to end this illegal and immoral practice. And according to 2030 Agenda, sustainable development cannot be realized without peace and security. And peace and security will be at risk without sustainable development. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of this evening. Thank you.